I started college as a musical theater major. And I went on to be a history major, and I focused on medieval and Renaissance British history, which was not the most practical thing that I could have majored in. At a certain point, I needed to get more practical about what I was going to be doing in my life. So I decided I was going to go to law school.
24-year-old Jessica Ravel grew up in New Jersey and is in her second year of law school at Rutgers University when the unthinkable happens nearby.
Okay, it sounds like we have some breaking news to tell you about out of New York. There's a
fire burning in the World Trade Center right now. We're just hearing about that right now.
Afterwards, I wanted to do something to help. Eventually, it kind of came to me that the skills of being a lawyer translated into being able to work in the intelligence community or service in the Navy. It was a place that I really could contribute and do something towards helping after 9/11.
With a vision for her future now crystallizing, Jessica sinks herself into her studies, leaving little time for leisure.
Everything was just going really well, but going into the winter of that year, I realized that the thing that was missing in my life was a guy. What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future. I complained to one of my girlfriends that there just weren't any good men in the world anymore, and she laughed and said, "Oh man, do I have the guy for you." He's in the Navy, he is a doctor, he's really just intelligent and funny, and I think you would get along well with him. So I was all like, yeah, bring that on. Let's see where that could go.
It's early December when Jessica heads down to the Hard Rock Cafe in Philadelphia for a blind date with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis.
I got there first, and when he walked in, I was honestly kind of underwhelmed. He walked in a black t-shirt and black jeans, and he was really pale. And he had this kind of weird flat top haircut. Not too flattering. I mean, not unattractive, but not attractive either. It definitely wasn't love at first sight. Jeff told me that he grew up on the West Coast. His mother ran a school. His father was a pilot. He talked a lot about how he was a flight surgeon in the Navy and his work as an emergency room doctor. There was something I found attractive about him. He was funny, but he was also arrogant. Looking back with hindsight, I think that I made excuses for that. So after the date, Jeff walked me to the train station, and there was no goodnight kiss, which was fine with me at the time. I wasn't sure even that I liked him.
And Jessica isn't sure whether Jeffrey likes her either, until she gets a call from him the following week asking for a second date.
I said, yeah, why not? I didn't have a bad time with him, so why not go out with him again? When we went out for the second time, we actually decided that we were going to get Chinese food and watch a movie at my house. So he came to my door, and before he even walked through, he said, "Hey, Chunky Butt, how are you doing?" And I just kind of looked at him, and I was like, what woman wants to be called Chunky Butt? So I actually said to him, "Hey, could you please not call me that, because it's just not cool." I was a beauty queen. I spent time in a swimsuit being judged on my appearance. Being called Chunky Butt, at that time, it was just so not true.
It's an awkward beginning to their evening, but the tension eases up.
We set up the movie and started eating, opened a bottle of wine, and, just talked. We were having a pretty good time, and we got through most of the bottle of wine, and suddenly, I have no idea what happened. I do remember being in my kitchen and him kissing me. And that was the last thing that I remembered until the next morning. All of a sudden, he's in my bed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I totally didn't mean to do that. That wasn't on my agenda for the evening. There should have been no reason for me to black out after, let's say, half a bottle of wine. Even if I had drunk the entire bottle of wine, blacking out just isn't something that happens to me. So kind of waking up not remembering anything was strange.
That blackout period, that time she can't account for, to wake up and not know why or how somebody is still there, that unknown is very scary.
Jessica doubts herself to the point where she wonders if Jeffrey will have a bad opinion of her for sleeping with him so quickly.
But when he woke up, he told me what a great time he had last night. So I just said to myself, you know what, I might as well at this point go out with him again, since we've already gone there. And that morning we went for breakfast. And at some point it turned into a relationship that at first was really nice. He was charming. He was attentive. We talked a lot about having a future together and what that may look like. I remember we went to dinner one night in an Italian restaurant. And this restaurant had kind of an alcove where there was a table for two. No one had ever done something like that for me before. It was very romantic. So at some point, the relationship, it just worked. We were happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with where things were going. He was a good guy. And I was looking forward, into what a future might look like with him.
The relationship becomes serious, but the demands of Jeffrey's job means their time together is often disrupted.
He would frequently call me and say, all right, sorry, I got to go off and save lives. And then he would come home and tell me that, he had saved a baby or a pregnant woman or, something that would really just pull at the heartstrings, that made me feel good that I was dating this guy who really helped people.
It's been barely 2 months since they met, and Jeff goes radio silent for periods of time. Jessica becomes suspicious until one night when he tells her he has an important confession to make.
He said that he was a non-official cover agent for the CIA. He said that he had gotten special permission to tell me because I was someone who was special in his life, who he felt like he was going to have a future with, and that I needed to know and understand who he was and all of him. It's not that he wasn't an ER doctor and he wasn't a flight surgeon. He was, but they were both a cover for what he did for the CIA.
It's a little over a year since 9/11, and fighting terror is on everyone's mind.
That was a major milestone in our relationship. It was clear that he felt like I was someone he wanted to be a part of his life. In fairness, that was flattering to me that he would get special permission to share something so important, with me. There were periods of time when he would go away, that I wouldn't know where he was or where he was going. And during that time, he always said that it was because he was off fighting terrorists.
It will be years before Jessica discovers the unfathomable truth about what Jeff is really doing while undercover.
Marsalis was audacious. He was bold. He felt that he was never going to get caught.
It was just a very Jekyll and Hyde existence.
I took a sip of the drink that was mine, and I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. I was very confused.
Jessica Ravel is getting deeper into a relationship with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis, hoping that one day they'd get married and become a power couple.
He was helping people, and that was really attractive to me. We talked a lot about a future together and what that would look like with me as a lawyer, him as the doctor.
In January 2002, Jessica and Jeff go to Bermuda for their first weekend getaway.
When we first landed, it was freezing, and there wasn't anyone around. We got to the hotel. I think that it was under construction because it was an off season. It was not the most romantic environment for a trip.
Jeff suggests they rent a scooter. They ride out to a remote beach, but the journey is far from idyllic.
I started getting scared. Because it was dark and we were the only people there, I told him that I wanted to go back, and he told me no, and he just kept driving. He was swerving the scooter in a way that felt dangerous to me. He was laughing in a way that just felt incredibly unhinged. And I remember just crying and telling him I wanted to go back. And he was like, "What do you think, I'm gonna kill you?" "I'm afraid. I want to go back. You're not wanting to take me back, and that's just scary."
This could be a test on Jeffrey's behalf of scaring her, but then showing her that nothing's going to happen and he is her protector.
Finally, Jeff climbs on the scooter and they ride back to the hotel.
By the time we got back to the hotel, I was just a total mess. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be there. And it was one of those situations in which he started telling me, "You're going to have to learn to have my sort of sense of humor."
Jeff's strange mood continues, and he seems intent on baiting Jessica.
He proceeded to tell me about a time that he and his friend, who was also in the CIA, saw two guys coming out of the club, and they thought, let's pick a fight. So they picked a fight with the guys.
And this is when Jeff drops a bombshell.
He ended up killing one of them, and his friend put the other one in the hospital. He told me that when the police came, he basically showed them his CIA card and he got right out of it. That should have been a moment that was just a huge red flag. And I know it sounds probably ridiculous, but he had a way of normalizing things that were just ridiculous and horrible. This is an example of something that I've done with one of my friends. And if you can't appreciate that, then we're not going to be able to have a future together. He had this training, and sometimes instinct just took him somewhere that, normal people don't go. I think that I rationalized that it was part of what he did as part of the CIA.
On another trip, Jeff's vanity is on full display.
We went on this Disney cruise, and then we spent a couple of days in Florida. Jeff was obsessed with taking pictures of him in different settings and different poses and different states of dress. He got really dramatic with the way that he posed. He would, kind of put his head back and smile. And I just found it really strange that he was so obsessed with having these pictures of himself. The one thing that he did express interest in was becoming an astronaut. We then go to Cape Canaveral, where he decides that he needs a picture of himself in an astronaut costume. I remember asking him, well, why do you need to do that if you're going to go to astronaut training? He was like, well, it's just a fun thing to do. After we were done with the photo session, he was very excited about the picture. He actually gave it to me as a gift.
On their first Valentine's Day in 2002, Jeff tells Jessica he wants to show her where he works.
Jeff said he had something really special planned for us. And we went from his apartment to the hospital. He seemed to have access to everywhere. He then proceeded to take me to the cadaver lab. He opened drawers with dead people, showed me different organs. And suddenly he ripped off the guy's arm and then chased me around the cadaver lab with it while he laughed maniacally. I was terrified, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. He asked me why I thought it was such a big deal.
When they return to his apartment, Jessica is furious.
I remember grabbing my bag and just telling him I was leaving, and he blocked the door. He wouldn't allow me to leave. It was just one of the first times I saw behind the mask.
Despite this deeply disturbing incident, Jessica and Jeff continue to see each other. And in the summer of 2003, Jessica graduates from Rutgers Law School.
I took time and did some research into where I might want to be. I ultimately ended up enlisting in the Navy as an intelligence specialist.
Over the next year, Jessica launches her new career as Jeff continues to serve the Navy and CIA in his undercover capacity.
He would be going off on what he called missions. He's playing me recordings of what he says are him interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan, and all I hear is screaming. He played those things for me pretty regularly. I was 24, 25, and at that age, I didn't have a lot of experience with the world. It seemed like, oh my gosh, I knew what the CIA was from movies and TV, and what he was telling me made sense.
Jessica thinks the pressure of Jeff's work or some unknown stressor is making him increasingly controlling.
He started isolating me from my friends, getting me to a point where I needed to rely on him for comfort, for friendship, because I just didn't have anyone else. Either I stopped talking to them or my life was just getting too crazy with him and they stopped talking to me. I came to think that this was just my life and something that I needed to deal with, because if I didn't, people were going to get hurt. He talked about killing people, so there was definitely a part of me that was quite sure he was capable of doing that to me or people I loved.
Jessica becomes scared in her relationship.
I just started looking for coping mechanisms. I would literally go to the gym and do an aerobics class and then run 10 miles a night. So I had an excuse to not be near him. I trained for a marathon so that I wouldn't be able to see him on weekends because I was just afraid.
After more than 2 years of dating, Jeff pops the question in April 2004.
You would think getting engaged is supposed to be this happy, exciting thing. But by the time that, he brought it up, I was already in that state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him. So I said, okay. And that was it.
But unbeknownst to Jessica, Jeff is leading a sinister double life.
I totally lost my 20s to this horrible, horrible person. And they're not something that I can ever get back.
After their engagement, Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis asks fiancée Jessica Ravel to accompany him on a trip out west.
His dad was his idol, so it was just a really big deal that I was going out to Park City, Utah to meet his dad. We went skiing, we went shopping. From what I recall, we did a lot of nice things on that trip. Seeing the normalcy of the family really made me question, where did he come from? Because they were just so kind and welcoming.
But it remains a stark contrast to Jeff's disturbing and frenetic energy.
He busts open the drawer and just starts screaming at me. He's got a shotgun and he's pointing it at me and he's just screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." When he was done screaming, he took a pause and he looked at me and said, "Just kidding," and turned around and pranced out of the bathroom. I think at that point, I was just so broken down. I let it go as one of those things that I needed to deal with in my life.
Back in Philadelphia, Jeff's abusive behavior continues.
I remember being on the phone with him, and I didn't care if he killed me. I didn't care if I lived. I just couldn't deal with him anymore. And something just, clicked in my head. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I hung up on him, and I immediately called 911 and said I needed help. I needed help. And as they were sending police over, I called my mom and I told her everything that was happening. And, it was kind of one of those, why didn't you tell us moments?
The police arrive and escort Jessica safely downtown to file a temporary restraining order.
It could have gone the wrong way any number of times. Handling it the way I did actually may have saved my life.
Soon, Jessica will learn that she is not alone, because Jeff's undercover work for the Navy and CIA has been a cover for something completely different.
It was March of 2004 when I began communicating with Jeffrey Marsalis. It was a time in my life where I was interested in getting married and having children.
Joanne Bottaro Cooper is single with a successful career in marketing when she decides to give online dating a try.
Jeffrey Marsalis' profile looked like he was a good catch. He had pictures of him in his medical scrubs with an astronaut's uniform. He had a lot of other pictures. Jeffrey said that he wanted to meet me out for a date, and I said yes. I lived in New Jersey, so he planned for me to come into Philly.
They go to a popular Irish bar in Philadelphia, the Tur Na Nog, where he describes his thriving career as an astronaut.
I was excited because he actually looked like his profile. As we were chatting and sat down at the bar, he started describing his residency program and the NASA program, and I was interested. He was interesting. He lived in a high-rise apartment building in the city that was also just a few blocks from where we were. So we went down to his apartment. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said no to an alcoholic drink. So I just wanted something non-alcoholic, whether it be water or soda. I sat down on the couch. We started to talk a little bit. He did kiss me. I then took a sip of the drink that was mine. And I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. My head hurt. Every part of me hurt. I was violently ill. I knew I had sex with him. There was no question. But I didn't know why, because I had no intentions of staying over in his apartment, of having sex with him. I blacked out for probably about 8 hours. There's nothing in between my taking the sip of the drink and then waking up the next morning. I chalked it up to maybe not having enough to eat on Friday.
When Marsalis wakes up, his reaction seems to indicate nothing is amiss.
He started chatting with me like everything was normal, like what we did was normal, and I didn't say anything to him that I didn't remember anything. I just kept it all to myself. So I had assumed that I, wanted it, and I can't really explain it. I wish I could, but I can't explain it to myself. I just figured I would just forget about it. I was just gonna put it away and move on.
Over a year after Joanne dated Jeff, Jessica gets an unexpected call from the manager of his apartment building.
She called me and said, "Hey, I think you need to call the Philadelphia SBU." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Why? What happened?" And she said, just call them.
Jessica immediately reaches out.
I remember them asking me questions, and some of them were about him dating other people, and I had no idea.
The special agents tell Jessica that Jeff is accused of raping at least 2 women while she has been engaged to him.
At first, I don't know if I was in denial. I understood what my experience was, but as they were asking me questions about what sounded like the experiences of other women, it just, gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There came a point when I was talking with the detectives that kind of a light bulb went off, and it all kind of came together. The last couple years of my life were basically one big date rape. I came to understand that it wasn't just me, and that was just so scary.
I have to almost laugh at that. Let's get over the profile. And eventually we're going to see me as the person who I am inside. The caring, the loving, the nurturing, the easygoing, the great guy.
In March 2005, Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit launches an investigation into Jeffrey Marsalis.
The first victim that came in said she had met him on a dating website. They went out on a date. She said they had a couple drinks, went back to his apartment. She woke up with him on top of her. And then wake up the next morning, he kind of sweet talks her into like, hey, we were both drinking, we had a good time, we should go out again. And she did. But after he stopped talking to her, it was really bothering her. And she came in and made a report.
By this time, it's too late to conduct a rape kit or drug test on the victim. But police obtain a search warrant for Jeff's apartment.
The first time he's not home, so we go to the manager of the apartment complex.
When the building manager reads the search warrant, she is visibly distressed.
You could see the blood just like go like this, just go right off her face. And we looked at her, she says, he did the same thing to me. We went to search his apartment. Screensaver had CIA on it. He had a bulletproof vest there. He had a doctor's coat with his name on it.
They also find what appear to be classified CIA documents, all of which are later determined to be forgeries.
Mr. Marsalis was very good and very committed to pretending to be a doctor. And he convinced other doctors, other patients, other people in the hospital that he was Dr. Marsalis. He came from tremendous privilege. He was given the opportunity to go to a number of great schools, but by the time we encountered him, he was a nursing school dropout who went around lying about who he was and victimizing women. What we found on his computer was a list that he kept. He called it the Yearly Calendar of Women, and that contained the first names of a number of women he had had sexual intercourse with.
They found a list of about 50 women.
We were shocked to learn that it wasn't 2 people who were raped by Marsalis or 3 or 4, but it was many, many women who were all victimized in the same way.
One of the names on the list is Joanne Bottaro Cooper.
Someone who worked for the assistant district attorney started to ask me if I knew Jeffrey Marsalis. She explained to me why they were calling me and what he was being investigated for. And at that moment, I had a flood of emotions. Everything that didn't make sense to me back in March of '04 came at me hard. I hung up the phone and I ran into the bathroom and I had an emotional breakdown.
Jeffrey Marsalis is arrested in April 2005, but makes bail and flees to his mother's condo in Utah. Jessica, Joanne, and a group of other victims work with police to prepare for trial.
We came up with a plan between the Philadelphia police detectives and FBI agents. Some of the victims were local, some were in the surrounding counties, some were in other states, and we started to slowly interview all of those individuals.
It becomes evident that none of the witnesses reported the rapes to police in a timely enough manner to conduct drug tests or a rape kit.
The investigation never identified the actual drug that he used. I think the strength of this case was the volume of victims who did not know one another, but yet their stories all were very similar.
The prosecutor chooses the 3 cases he will present at the trial.
I was a witness. They called me the glue that brought everything together. Because he was doing all of this while we were together, I was the baseline, the patient 0. He started with me and then just continued with these other women. We're all professional, successful women, just confident. And his mother is a strong woman, an educated woman, a confident woman, a successful woman. And it always struck me as bizarre that he chose his victims almost in the image of his mother.
The victims were very brave for being willing to share their story with the jury. Marsalis' defense attorney told the jury that the victims were lying and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding and that Marsalis was the real victim. Marsalis looked very smug and confident.
Their strategy was, he's a liar, he's not a doctor, he's not the things that he said he was, but he's not a rapist. These were women who were looking for, Prince Charming. And he's not that, so they're upset and they conspired together because they had seen him again and then they had a consensual relationship that presented a challenge to get a successful prosecution.
In a controversial ABC interview with Marsalis, he reacts to their accusations of him lying about his profession.
The truth is simple. We had a great time, had consensual sex numerous times with one another. If I'm such a god-awful person, why do you keep on hanging out with me for?
He's extremely excited by it, but he's excited by it because he is gaining control over somebody who he shouldn't be able to get control over. They shouldn't be easy targets. And so therefore, by going after them, he has gained control, and that level of control thrills him, excites him, and just pushes him to do it again and again and again.
At the trial, the defense lawyers adopt a familiar tactic, victim blaming.
What were you wearing? Why did you sleep with him? Why did you sleep with him again? Why did you go out with him again? So it becomes more a focus on the victim's morality, if you will, than it does about the individual, the accused's culpability in the situation. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was no mechanism for there to be psychological testimony as to why rape victims act the way they do in the wake of a sexual assault. And that was problematic because with the jury, the actions that a person takes afterwards are not always what you would expect.
While the jury takes 5 days to deliberate, the victims hold their collective breath.
The result came in, and it was an acquittal.
Let me make something very, very clear to you. I have never drugged anybody. I have never raped anybody. I've never forced myself on anybody, ever.
It was difficult to hear the verdict of not guilty with respect to those 3 women. What Marsalis didn't expect, what caused the smug look on his face to disappear, was when he was arrested in the courtroom for what was going to be a second trial with 7 different women presenting their story to a jury.
After his acquittal and rearrest, victims continue to come forward, and Jeff becomes the focus of a new investigation. But hidden from the proceedings, just 2 weeks prior to the Philadelphia trial, Jeff is living in Sun Valley, Idaho.
His family had some affiliation with this resort, and he got a job there as a security guard.
It's there in October 2005 that Marsalis and a female coworker share a few drinks after work. When she's suddenly unable to walk, he puts her in a taxi and takes her back to his place to repeat a familiar scenario. But this time, Jeff's tried and true technique backfires.
She was a lesbian, and she knew that she was not going to be sleeping with a man. So she knew that she woke up and it wasn't right.
She was not confused about what happened to her. And so because she went to the police right away, the detectives were able to get a rape kit, to get physical evidence proving what had happened. They were able to talk to the bartender who talked about the drinks that were served. They were able to find witnesses who had seen her being dragged out of a taxi cab by Marsalis. This was exactly the kind of evidence that we did not have in Pennsylvania because the victim came forward right away.
Now, with another trial pending in Idaho, Philadelphia law enforcement take Jeffrey Marsalis to trial for the second time in May 2007. The case focuses on 7 women, bringing a total of 66 charges, including rape.
One of the women lived in his building, and a woman who had met Marsalis on a date after coming into Philadelphia from New Jersey.
That woman is Joanne Butaro Cooper.
I gave my testimony, and I got to stare him straight in the face and point at him and accuse him of the crimes he committed against me. That felt very empowering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. He saw me there and his face dropped. It felt really good to know that someone could scare him a little bit still.
After deliberating a week, the jury finds Marsalis guilty on 2 counts of sexual assault and impersonating a government official, but without physical evidence, acquits him of all other charges.
They found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women.
I was surprised that the jury did not see the truth and that he wasn't convicted on all counts.
He's a felon now, and he will always have to register as a sex offender.
With Jeff finally behind bars, Jessica begins the difficult task of rebuilding her life.
With every moment that you are moving forward and putting it further in your rear view, I look at my own life, and there are some tough years. It's not something that you ever forget. Certainly, it's always there. It's possible to get to a point that it's not the sole influence in your life.
Despite not being found guilty of rape, Marsalis is given a new moniker in the press, the Match.com rapist. It's not until April 2009 that the Idaho case goes to trial.
The jury heard that Marsalis denied having had any kind of intercourse with the victim, and yet a rape kit that was performed showed that he was a liar.
I felt like she was the strongest. She did what all of us hadn't done.
As Jeff enters the court for sentencing, he notices Jessica sitting in the gallery.
He thought he was being smug and he was getting to me. But at the end of the day, my being able to look back at him and, really just signal to him what a dirtbag he is was satisfying and an opportunity to just take my power back, and I did.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Marsalis guilty of rape.
When it comes to sentencing, the judge is able to take the dozens of cases from Pennsylvania into account.
The outcome of the 3rd trial was the most satisfying of all of them.
I will sentence you to a term of life imprisonment in the Idaho State Penitentiary.
Jeffrey Marsalis is declared a sexually violent predator.
It was the moment in which I knew that it wasn't wrong. I knew that it was not real. And I'm glad I went to Idaho, because I don't know whether I'd have gotten that closure otherwise.
I questioned myself instead of him, and I will never do that again. And I will make sure that I can speak out and tell women that you should always believe yourself first.
Joanne starts a rape crisis counseling organization, and eventually, through a mutual friend, reconnects with an old boyfriend from college.
I've been married for 3.5 years. I'm extremely happy in my job. I work for a nonprofit, and I just continue to do things that make me happy.
Without the bravery of all the survivors in this case, he'd still be out there doing it.
Jeffrey Marsalis is, in fact, one of the worst serial rapists in Pennsylvania's history.
After the Marsalis case, rape trials in Pennsylvania will never be the same.
When victim after victim shared the same story, and Marsalis was still acquitted of rape, the Pennsylvania legislature responded by changing the law, which allowed expert testimony to come into rape cases so that jurors could better understand the psychology and behavior of rape victims.
I want to let others know that this is not going to define you for the rest of your lives. This is a moment in time, and it sucks. Like, it really, truly sucks, but you get past it.
Jessica goes on to become an intelligence officer in the Navy and spends 20 years working for the FBI.
I'm an investigator at Microsoft now. There are so many good things that have gone on in my life. I'm married. I have 2 amazing, silly dogs, and I've got relationships that are strong with my family, my friends. I talk with universities, with businesses, with government agencies. I want people to know you're not alone. You're not alone. And no matter what you think has been taken away from you, you have the power to grab it back.
The dawn of December the 20th, 1929, broke over the coastline of Apia not with the sudden rupture of a storm, but with the profound, delicate stillness that often precedes the most devastating chapters of human history. The morning sunlight poured over the horizon, painting the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in brilliant shades of gold and deep, endless azure. The waves, ancient and rhythmic, murmured as they continually swept against the wooden hulls of the small boats moored along the shore, creating a steady, calming cadence that felt entirely detached from the brewing tensions of the era. It was a morning that seemed to promise the continuation of the peaceful, ancestral life that the people of Samoa had known for generations, a morning bathed in the gentle warmth of the tropical sun and the cool, salt-tinged breeze that drifted endlessly across the island. The sand, cool from the night, lay waiting for the footprints of a movement that would forever alter the trajectory of the nation. This was the island of Upolu, a place of profound natural beauty and deep-rooted cultural heritage, yet lying beneath the heavy, suffocating shadow of the New Zealand colonial administration. The landscape itself, with its swaying palm trees and impossibly clear waters, stood in stark, silent contrast to the heavy political machinations that sought to control it. On this specific morning, the natural tranquility of the Apia coastline was about to become the stage for a tragedy so profound, so intensely violent, that it would permanently scar the collective memory of the Samoan people and echo through the corridors of history under a name heavy with grief and blood, forever remembered as Black Saturday. As the sun climbed higher into the expansive morning sky, the shoreline began to stir not with the chaotic clamor of an uprising, but with the deliberate, synchronized grace of a deeply spiritual congregation. From the villages and the surrounding lands, the people of Samoa gathered, converging upon the coastline of Apia in numbers that swelled into the thousands. They moved not as a fragmented mob, but as a unified, breathing entity, driven by a singular, unyielding desire for self-determination and the restoration of their sovereignty. This was the Mau movement, a peaceful resistance born from the profound indignities of colonial rule, a movement that sought to reclaim the dignity of the Samoan people not through the barrel of a gun, but through the undeniable moral force of nonviolent solidarity. The visual poetry of their gathering was striking, a moving tapestry of indigenous pride and unwavering resolve. As they marched along the sandy expanse of the beach, history captures a singular, defining detail, the thousands of bare feet pressing softly into the sand. There was a profound humility, yet an unshakable strength, in that simple, grounded connection to the earth of their ancestors. They were tethered to their land, marching upon the very soil they sought to govern themselves, their footsteps creating a soft, rhythmic thud that blended seamlessly with the ambient murmurs of the encroaching tide. The attire of the marchers further underscored the peaceful, deeply cultural nature of their demonstration. They wore their traditional garments, the fabric draping elegantly across their bodies, a visual rejection of the imposed colonial uniforms and a vibrant celebration of their indigenous identity. Behind their ears, they wore freshly picked flowers, fragile and beautiful, symbolizing the pure, nonviolent intentions resting at the very core of their hearts. These were not soldiers preparing for a theater of war. They were civilians, elders, women, and young men, armed only with their heritage and their unshakable belief in the righteousness of their cause. The sheer absence of weaponry among the thousands of marchers was absolute. There were no blades reflecting the morning light, no firearms hidden beneath their garments, no instruments of destruction whatsoever. Their vulnerability was their most potent statement. They walked with their hands open and their heads held high, embodying a philosophy that believed, perhaps with a tragic sense of optimism, that the righteousness of a peaceful cause could serve as an impenetrable shield against the brutal machinery of colonial oppression. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that a demonstration devoid of malice could not possibly be met with the ultimate cruelty of fatal violence. As the vast procession moved forward, a sound rose from the depths of the crowd, a sound so powerful and deeply resonant that it seemed to vibrate the very air around them. It was a chorus, a deeply harmonious and solemn anthem of the Mao movement, sung by thousands of voices uniting in perfect, sorrowful, yet hopeful unison. The deep, rumbling baritones of the men intertwined with the higher, piercing melodies of the women, creating an auditory wave that washed over the coastal road of Apia. This was not a chaotic shouting of slogans, it was a hymn of resilience, a musical manifestation of their collective soul. The slow, majestic tempo of their singing matched the deliberate, unhurried pace of their march. Every note carried the weight of their history, the sting of their marginalization, and the fervent, burning hope for an independent future. The sound was majestic and sacred, transforming the sandy coastline into an open-air cathedral of political and spiritual defiance. The murmuring ocean seemed to quiet in deference to the immense, swelling harmony of the Samoan people, the natural world bearing witness to a breathtaking display of peaceful patriotism. The singing served as a protective blanket, a sonic embrace that connected every individual in the crowd, reinforcing their courage and masking the underlying anxieties that naturally accompany any confrontation with an occupying force. Yet, as this majestic river of humanity flowed slowly down the coastal road, the peaceful atmosphere was constantly shadowed by an invisible, yet deeply palpable, tension. The route of their procession brought them inevitably closer to the epicenter of colonial authority, the heavily fortified police station that stood as a grim, structural reminder of their subjugation. Here, the profound visual and philosophical contrast that defines this tragic narrative began to sharpen into a sickening focus. While the Samoan marchers walked barefoot in traditional fabrics, adorned with flowers and armed only with their voices, the enforcers of the New Zealand colonial administration waited in the wings, fundamentally alien to the spirit of the land they occupied. The imagery shifts drastically from the soft sand and the flowing garments to the harsh, rigid lines of authority. The black, highly polished leather boots of the colonial police officers stood firmly on the paved surfaces, an unnatural, authoritative presence entirely divorced from the organic rhythm of the island. These boots, gleaming with a cold, institutional precision, represented the heavy, uncompromising footprint of an empire that viewed this beautiful display of indigenous solidarity not as a plea for dialogue, but as a direct, insufferable threat to its supremacy. The geographical setting itself played a crucial role in framing this impending disaster. Apia, nestled along the northern coast of Upolu, served as the administrative heart of the territory, a physical intersection where the ancient, natural beauty of the Pacific collided violently with the rigid, geometric impositions of European colonialism. The beachfront road, where the marchers systematically advanced, was a narrow corridor of history, flanked on one side by the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, and on the other by the colonial structures that housed the instruments of their subjugation. The marchers, moving steadily along this corridor, were effectively walking a tightrope between the freedom represented by the endless sea and the confinement imposed by the looming architecture of the police station. The sea breeze, carrying the faint, briny scent of salt and the lush, earthy fragrance of the tropical interior, brushed against their faces, offering a fleeting, sensory reminder of the natural liberties they were fighting to reclaim. Yet, this natural beauty was continually undermined by the stark reality of their political situation. The marchers were acutely aware of the risk they were taking. The history of colonial encounters in the Pacific was already stained with violence, yet the Mao movement, under the guidance of their revered leadership, had chosen a path of radical, unyielding nonviolence. This choice was not born of weakness, but of a profound, sophisticated understanding of moral authority. They sought to expose the inherent illegitimacy of the colonial administration by forcing it to react to peaceful assembly with unjustified force, a strategy that required immense, almost superhuman discipline and courage from every single individual walking the sandy path that morning. As the thousands of participants continued their rhythmic, singing progression, one must consider the profound internal resolve required to maintain such an orderly, peaceful facade in the face of heavily armed opposition. Mothers held the hands of their children, elders leaned on their walking sticks, and young men, possessing the physical vitality to fight, instead channeled their energy entirely into the resonant depths of their choral singing. They were bound together by a collective discipline that was as beautiful as it was fragile. The visual majesty of their procession, the sea of white and brown fabrics, the vibrant splashes of tropical flowers, the synchronized movement of thousands of bare feet, was a living, breathing testament to their cultural resilience. They were not merely protesting a specific policy, they were asserting their very right to exist as a sovereign people, refusing to be diminished or erased by the bureaucratic machinery of the New Zealand administration. The contrast between the organic, flowing nature of the Mau procession and the static, heavily fortified presence of the colonial police force became increasingly pronounced with every passing second. The police station, a structure built to intimidate and control, cast a long, cold shadow over the sunlit road, a physical manifestation of the impending violence that was about to shatter the morning peace. The officers, standing in their dark uniforms, their heavy leather boots firmly planted on the ground, represented an immovable, unfeeling barrier to the river of humanity flowing toward them. They were the agents of an empire that could not comprehend the language of peaceful resistance, an empire that viewed any assertion of indigenous rights as an intolerable rebellion that needed to be crushed with absolute, terrifying finality. The emotional atmosphere, previously defined by the sacred and the hopeful, began to fray at the edges as the march approached the critical juncture. The slow, solemn pace of the Mau procession continued, the singing never wavering, yet a subtle shift in the air signaled the approaching catastrophe. The colonial police force, heavily armed and operating under the rigid, unforgiving directives of their superiors, watched the approaching sea of peaceful protesters with a mounting, irrational hostility. For the administration, the sheer size of the peaceful gathering was an affront, a massive, undeniable rejection of their legitimacy. The air grew thick with a dreadful anticipation, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs in the microsecond before a lightning strike. The marchers, despite their vulnerability, did not waver. They continued to step forward, their bare feet moving in rhythm with their ancestors, their voices continuing to carry the melodies of freedom across the coastal breeze, trusting in the inherent morality of their peaceful assembly. This moment, suspended in time on the morning of December the 28th, encapsulates the tragic innocence of the Mau movement. It is a moment of pure, agonizing suspense, a cinematic tableau where the forces of peaceful, dignified resistance are brought into direct, physical proximity with the mechanisms of brutal, unyielding state violence. The viewer of history is forced to linger in this heartbreaking calm, to absorb the full, devastating weight of the contrast between the unarmed, singing civilians and the grim, militarized posture of the colonial police. The tragedy of Black Saturday is entirely predicated on this precise juxtaposition, the absolute, verified peacefulness of the Samoan people against the disproportionate, heavily armed paranoia of the occupying power. The profound sorrow of the narrative is rooted deeply in the knowledge that the marchers' faith in their peaceful methods would soon be shattered by the most extreme, technologically advanced forms of violence available to the administration. The morning sun continued to shine brilliantly upon the waters of Apia, illuminating a scene of breathtaking human dignity that was, tragically and inexorably, marching directly toward a slaughter. The tension is drawn out, a tightly coiled spring of historical inevitability, preparing to release an explosion of violence that would extinguish lives, stain the pristine sands with unimaginable bloodshed, and forever cement the legacy of the Mau movement in the annals of anti-colonial struggle. Every gentle wave, every harmonious note of their song, and every barefoot step on the sand served only to heighten the devastating impact of the horrors that were about to unfold, creating an atmosphere of unbearable, tragic suspense that forms the foundational heartbreak of this historical event. The transition from absolute serenity to absolute chaos does not always announce itself with a thunderclap. Sometimes, it begins with a single, aggressive, and entirely discordant movement that shatters the fragile equilibrium of a space. Along the sun-drenched coastal road of Apia, the majestic, harmonious procession of the Mao movement had established a profound rhythm, a deeply spiritual cadence that resonated with the very heartbeat of the island. But this rhythm, this beautiful manifestation of peaceful resistance, was abruptly and violently severed by the calculated aggression of the New Zealand colonial police force. The visual starkness of this rupture was immediate and jarring. The perspective violently shifts from the flowing, traditional garments and the bare feet of the marching Samoans to the rigid, highly militarized posture of the colonial enforcers. The polished, heavy black leather boots of the police officers, previously planted in a stance of tense observation, suddenly sprang into aggressive motion. These boots, heavy with the weight of imperial authority and absolute intolerance, struck the paved ground with a sharp, aggressive clatter that cut through the sweeping baritones of a Samoan chorus like a physical blade. The authorities had identified their target within the vast, moving sea of humanity. Their objective was not dispersal, but a surgically aggressive extraction. They had locked their sights onto the secretary of the Mao movement, a figure representing the organizational heartbeat of the peaceful resistance, intending to rip him away from the protective embrace of his people. This was the precise moment the unwritten contract of the peaceful morning was irrevocably torn apart. The colonial officers did not issue a warning. They did not attempt a negotiation or a peaceful dialogue. Instead, a contingent of these armed, uniformed men launched themselves violently into the dense, unsuspecting ranks of the civilian marchers. They moved with a blunt, frantic hostility, a terrifying physical manifestation of a regime that fundamentally refused to recognize the humanity or the rights of the people it sought to govern. As they breached the outer edge of the procession, their heavy hands and rigid batons became instruments of immediate, chaotic disruption. They shoved, struck, and violently cleared a path through the nonviolent demonstrators, treating the bodies of elders, women, and young men not as citizens, but as mere physical obstacles to be brutally tossed aside. The visual contrast in this fraction of a second was profoundly sickening. On one side was the vulnerable, yielding flesh of individuals adorned in soft traditional fabrics and delicate tropical flowers. On the other was the unforgiving, hard edges of colonial uniforms, leather, and institutional fury. The officers threw their weight forward, a battering ram of state-sanctioned aggression slicing through a congregation of peace, their eyes fixed solely on the secretary, entirely indifferent to the physical and emotional devastation they were inflicting upon the innocent bodies they trampled and pushed away in their desperate, violent surge forward. The auditory landscape of the Apia coastline transformed in a matter of seconds, morphing from a sacred, harmonious hymn into a horrifying cacophony of sudden terror and frantic struggle. The deep, resonant singing, which had previously blanketed the morning in a dignified grace, was instantly fractured. In its place, the air was suddenly pierced by the sharp, terrifying sounds of human panic. The violent shouts of the charging colonial officers, barking orders in English, a language of administration and subjugation that now became the language of their physical assault, collided violently with the startled cries of the Samoan marchers. The sickening, visceral sounds of physical impact began to echo along the beachfront. The dull, heavy thuds of batons striking unprotected shoulders, the tearing of fabric, and the frantic shuffling of thousands of bare feet attempting to maintain balance against the sudden, crushing pressure of the police charge created a suffocating wave of noise. The marchers, who had trained themselves to endure indignity with stoic silence, were suddenly thrust into a chaotic fight for their physical safety and the safety of their leadership. The serenity of the ocean waves was entirely drowned out by this sudden explosion of kinetic, panicked energy. The air itself seemed to thicken, choked by the dust kicked up from the scuffle and the sudden, sharp exhalations of a crowd thrust into immediate, unexpected peril. Yet, in the face of this sudden, deeply violent provocation, the inherent philosophy of the Mao movement dictated a response that was as desperate as it was heroic. The Samoan people did not break and run. They did not scatter into the surrounding landscape to save themselves. Instead, driven by an immense, almost instinctual sense of communal loyalty and a profound dedication to their cause, they collapsed inward, moving toward the epicenter of the violence to protect their targeted secretary. As the colonial police closed their brutal grip upon the official, dragging him violently by his clothing, a wave of human bodies surged forward to intervene. Crucially, and tragically, the Samoans remained entirely unarmed. They possessed no blades, no firearms, no instruments of counterviolence. They had only their bare hands, their bodies, and their unwavering solidarity. The scene descended into a suffocating, deeply physical struggle of flesh against uniform. Hundreds of bare hands reached out, frantic and desperate, grasping at the arms and shoulders of the police officers, pulling at their uniforms, desperately trying to pry their leader free from the clutches of the colonial authorities. They formed a desperate, living shield, throwing their unprotected bodies between the heavy batons of the police and the vulnerable frame of their secretary. This was not a calculated military maneuver. It was an organic, deeply emotional reaction born of pure, unadulterated love for their community and a desperate refusal to see their dignity stripped away in broad daylight. The sheer density of the crowd, combined with the frantic, adrenaline-fueled struggle, turned the coastal road into a terrifying, suffocating vortex of human bodies. The air was entirely consumed by the heat and panic of the crush. Every individual within the epicenter of the melee was trapped in a claustrophobic nightmare of pushing, pulling, and screaming. The colonial officers, heavily outnumbered but possessing the terrifying advantage of institutional weapons and a mandate for violence, found themselves increasingly bogged down in the sheer mass of the resisting, bare-handed civilians. The officers swung their batons with increasing, panicked ferocity, striking blindly into the sea of brown faces and white fabrics, desperately trying to maintain their grip on the secretary, while simultaneously fending off the hundreds of hands that tore at their uniforms. The Samoans, absorbing the brutal blows without the capacity or the desire to return them in kind, pressed forward with an unyielding, collective weight. The struggle became a terrifying, swaying mass of humanity, a chaotic tug-of-war where the prize was a single human life and the broader dignity of an entire nation. The sand beneath their feet, previously marked by the orderly, rhythmic steps of a peaceful march, was now churned into a chaotic, messy arena of desperation and survival. In the heart of this suffocating, violent maelstrom, the dynamics of a panicked, unstructured confrontation inevitably lead to unforeseen and tragic consequences. A crowd of thousands, once pushed past the breaking point of passive endurance and forced into a frantic, physical defense of their own bodies, generates a terrifying, uncontrollable kinetic energy. The colonial police, having initiated the violence with a reckless disregard for the immense size and solidarity of the gathering, suddenly found themselves dangerously exposed within the very chaos they had created. As the struggle reached a fever pitch, the sheer, crushing pressure of the crowd, combined with the frantic, desperate blows delivered by bare hands fighting for survival, overwhelmed one of the colonial officers. The details of his fall remain lost in the chaotic, frantic blur of the struggle, a consequence of the terrifying, blinding momentum of a riot born from an unjust arrest. Under the suffocating weight of the frantic, defending crowd, amidst the desperate flailing of limbs and the agonizing screams of the assaulted marchers, the officer was pulled down into the churning, violent sea of bodies. He fell not to a coordinated, armed strike, but to the overwhelming, chaotic, and ultimately fatal crushing force of a crowd defending itself with the only thing it had left, its collective, physical mass. The officer was beaten and crushed in the terrifying undertow of the human wave, a grim, unintended casualty of a confrontation that should never have occurred, a fatal outcome directly precipitated by the reckless, aggressive intrusion of the police into a peaceful assembly. The death of the colonial police officer in the midst of this chaotic, bare-handed struggle served as the catastrophic turning point of the morning, the fatal catalyst that would plunge the event from a violent skirmish into an unparalleled historical atrocity. When the officer's body went limp and disappeared beneath the frantic feet of the crowd, an invisible, terrifying threshold was crossed. For the remaining colonial police forces, observing the chaos from the fortified perimeter of their station and embedded within the screaming crowd, the loss of one of their own did not signal a moment to de-escalate, to retreat, or to recognize the tragic consequences of their initial aggression. Instead, it triggered a massive, horrifying psychological shift. The inherent, racist paranoia of the colonial mindset, which had always viewed the indigenous population as a latent, savage threat, was suddenly and violently validated in their eyes. The peaceful nature of the Mau movement was instantly erased from their perception, replaced entirely by a terrifying vision of an uncontrollable, murderous mob. The desperate, bare-handed defense of the Samoans was stripped of its context and interpreted by the authorities as a full-scale, lethal insurrection. The air, already thick with the dust of the struggle and the agonizing cries of the injured, suddenly chilled with a terrifying, unspoken realization. The parameters of engagement had shifted irreversibly. The localized struggle around the secretary, initially a focused point of intense physical conflict, now radiated a profound, existential dread outward through the entire procession. The thousands of Samoans who had been marching peacefully just moments before now found themselves trapped in a horrifying, rapidly escalating nightmare. The cries of the injured, struck by heavy police batons, mixed with the frantic, desperate warnings shouted by those near the center of the fray. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a sudden, terrifying tightening of the colonial fist. The police officers who had initiated the charge began to forcibly extract themselves from the crush of the crowd, leaving the immediate physical struggle behind as they retreated toward the safety of their structural fortifications. This retreat, however, was not an act of surrender or a return to peace. It was a deeply ominous, tactical withdrawal, a pulling back that created a physical space between the administration and the indigenous people. This newly created space, this sudden, terrifying void between the retreating black boots and the advancing, desperate bare feet of the Samoan marchers, was not a buffer of safety, but a killing zone. The tension in this fleeting, agonizing moment was absolute and paralyzing. The violent, kinetic energy of the physical struggle momentarily plateaued, leaving a sickening, breathless silence in its wake, a silence that was not the return of peace, but the horrifying inhalation before a fatal scream. The Samoan marchers, bruised, panicked, and deeply traumatized by the sudden assault, stood their ground, their traditional garments torn, their defensive, bare-handed postures still maintained. They looked toward the heavy, colonial architecture of the police station, their eyes searching for a resolution, perhaps expecting a return to the tense standoff that had defined the morning. Instead, they were met with a terrifying, mechanical coldness. The institutional machinery of the New Zealand administration had made its fatal calculation. The death of the officer had removed all final restraints, providing the authorities with the perceived justification to unleash the ultimate, devastating power of their technological superiority upon a crowd that still, despite the chaos and the singular tragedy of the fallen officer, possessed absolutely no firearms. The profound vulnerability of the Mau movement, their reliance on moral authority over physical might, was about to be exploited in the most ruthless, devastating manner conceivable. The narrative of this tragedy hangs suspended in this exact, excruciating microsecond. It is a moment where the full, devastating weight of the historical injustice becomes completely unavoidable. The viewer is forced to witness the terrifying anatomy of a massacre, watching helplessly as the chaotic, hand-to-hand violence on the sandy coastal road transforms into something fundamentally different, something cold, mechanized, and infinitely more destructive. The transition from the organic, physical struggle of bodies pushing against bodies to the cold, distant, and absolute finality of the impending violence is deeply sickening. The Samoan people, having fought desperately with their bare hands to protect their leader and their dignity, were entirely unaware of the devastating shadow that was about to fall over them from the elevated vantage points of the colonial stronghold. The morning sun, which had initially illuminated a breathtaking display of peaceful solidarity, now glared down upon a scene of fractured innocence and impending doom. The stage had been violently, irrevocably set. The physical connection between the oppressed and the oppressor had been severed by the tactical retreat, replacing the chaotic struggle with a terrifying, clear line of sight, leaving the thousands of vulnerable, unarmed civilians perfectly exposed on the coastal road, waiting in agonizing, breathless suspense for a devastating mechanical fury that they could not possibly comprehend or defend against. The visual trajectory of the tragedy now shifts abruptly from the chaotic, swirling dust of the ground-level struggle to a stark, elevated perspective that alters the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The Colonial Police Station, a structure built with the heavy, unyielding architecture of imperial dominance, loomed over the coastal road like a fortress of absolute, unfeeling authority. The attention of the terrified, breathless crowd was drawn upward, away from the retreating line of officers and toward the shadowed recesses of the second-story balcony. Here, the final, devastating act of the morning was being silently prepared, stripped of any human passion and reduced to a terrifying, mechanical calculation. From the dark silhouette of the balcony railing, a heavy, metallic shape was slowly, deliberately pushed into the morning sunlight. It was the thick, unmistakable barrel of a Lewis machine gun. This was not an instrument of riot control or civilian policing. It was a weapon forged in the terrifying crucible of the First World War, designed with the singular, horrific purpose of devastating dense formations of human beings on a battlefield. The presence of this weapon in a civilian setting, aimed down at a crowd of men, women, and children whose only offense was a peaceful march for independence, represented a profound, chilling escalation. The heavy cooling jacket of the gun rested on the balcony ledge, a cold, engineered piece of steel contrasting violently with the soft, tropical breeze and the vulnerable, bare skin of the thousands of Samoans standing on the road below. The large, distinctive drum magazine sat atop the weapon, fully loaded with heavy-caliber military ammunition, holding within it the capacity to instantly transform the peaceful coastal avenue into a landscape of unimaginable carnage. The deployment of the Lewis machine gun suspended time in a horrifying, agonizing paralysis. For the thousands of Samoans looking up from the beach, the sight of the weapon induced a collective, paralyzing shock. They were a people who had committed themselves to the philosophy of nonviolence, who had marched with flowers behind their ears and songs in their hearts, firmly believing that their moral righteousness would shield them from absolute cruelty. Now, they were staring directly into the dark, hollow void of a machine gun barrel. The sheer disproportion of force was breathtaking and deeply sickening. Down below, there were bare hands, traditional cotton garments, and the soft sand of their ancestral homeland. Up above, secured behind a fortified balcony, was the apex of modern, industrialized lethality. The gunner, hidden behind the sights of the weapon, possessed an absolute, godlike power over the lives of everyone in the street. With a singular, slight pressure of an index finger, they could unleash a storm of lead that no amount of courage, solidarity, or peaceful intent could possibly withstand. The air, already thick with the dust of the previous scuffle and the heavy, terrified breathing of the crowd, seemed to freeze entirely. It was a microsecond of profound, existential dread, the exact, terrifying moment before an irreversible historical atrocity is committed. The beautiful, sweeping curves of the Apia coastline, the brilliant blue of the Pacific Ocean, and the vibrant colors of the traditional Samoan dress were all about to be violently erased by the cold, mechanical reality of colonial retaliation. The devastating silence was shattered not by a human command, but by the sharp, metallic snap of the gun's internal mechanism, instantly followed by a catastrophic eruption of fire and sound. The muzzle of the Lewis gun ignited with a terrifying, rhythmic brilliance, flashing a bright, hostile orange against the serene backdrop of the tropical morning. This was not a single, isolated shot, but a continuous, unrelenting stream of mechanical violence. The muzzle flash flickered with a demonic speed, a blinding strobe light of destruction that pulsed in perfect, lethal synchronization with the internal cycling of the weapon. With every flash, a heavy-caliber bullet was violently expelled from the barrel, driven by expanding gases that sent a plume of acrid, gray smoke billowing out from the balcony. The smoke quickly began to veil the shooter, transforming the origin of the violence into a faceless, obscured cloud of colonial fury. The mechanical rhythm of the Lewis gun was chillingly steady, a rapid, percussive pounding that possessed absolutely no hesitation, no empathy, and no conscience. It was the sound of industrial slaughter applied to a civilian population. The weapon swept back and forth across the balcony railing in a deliberate, sweeping arc, ensuring that the devastating rain of lead was distributed widely and indiscriminately across the dense mass of humanity trapped on the narrow coastal road below. The gunner was not aiming at specific individuals. They were firing into a crowd, treating the thousands of Samoan men, women, and children as a single, monolithic target to be eradicated through the sheer volume of high-velocity ammunition. The auditory experience of this moment was a complete, overwhelming annihilation of the senses. The Lewis machine gun fired with a deafening, concussive roar that immediately overpowered and erased every other sound on the island. The gentle, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the shoreline was completely swallowed by the explosive crack of the gunfire. The panicked shouts of the crowd, the frantic prayers, and the desperate warnings shouted from person to person were entirely muted by the sheer, physical pressure of the sound waves generated by the weapon. The noise was so immense, so violently loud, that it ceased to be a mere sound and became a physical force, vibrating violently against the eardrums and chests of the people trapped below. This continuous, deafening roar created a terrifying sensory deprivation chamber on the open beach. As the firing sustained its relentless pace, the human auditory system, completely overwhelmed by the acoustic trauma, began to shut down. The explosive cracks of the individual bullets merged into a continuous, suffocating drone, eventually giving way to a high-pitched, agonizing ringing in the ears. This sudden, induced deafness plunged the victims into a horrifying, silent nightmare. They could see the terrifying flashes from the balcony, they could see the catastrophic destruction occurring all around them, and they could see the contorted, screaming faces of their loved ones, but the only sound that registered was the sharp, piercing scream of their own traumatized eardrums. The world had been violently stripped of its natural sounds, replaced entirely by the deafening frequency of absolute terror. The physical reality of the bullets striking the ground further intensified the surreal, horrifying atmosphere of the massacre. Viewed through a lens of profound shock, the trajectory of the machine gun fire appeared almost as a terrifying, slow-motion descent. The heavy, copper-jacketed projectiles, traveling at supersonic speeds, plunged downward from the elevated balcony, striking the paved coastal road and the adjacent sandy beach with devastating kinetic energy. Wherever the bullets impacted the hard surface of the street, they instantly pulverized the pavement, sending sharp, jagged fragments of stone and concrete flying into the air like miniature shrapnel. Small, violent geysers of dust and debris erupted across the road, tracking the terrifying, sweeping path of the gunner's aim. When the bullets struck the soft sand of the beach, they kicked up violent plumes of white powder, creating a strange, macabre dance of earth and dust amidst the fleeing crowd. The sheer density of the incoming fire meant that there was absolutely no safe haven, no corner of the road that was not being systematically torn apart by the relentless hail of lead. The crowd, initially frozen by the terrifying sight of the weapon, was suddenly thrust into a frantic, chaotic scramble for survival. But there was nowhere to hide. They were trapped in a fatal bottleneck between the unforgiving ocean and the fortified colonial structures, exposed entirely to a plunging fire that rained down upon them with the indiscriminate, devastating force of a mechanized storm. The very ground they had marched upon with such pride and dignity was now exploding beneath their feet, transformed instantly into an inescapable killing field. The true, unspeakable horror of the Lewis gun, however, was realized in the fraction of a second when the high-velocity rounds intersected with the soft, unprotected bodies of the Samoan marchers. The bullets did not merely strike the victims, they tore through them with a catastrophic, devastating force that the human body is entirely unequipped to withstand. The traditional, light fabrics worn by the marchers offered absolutely zero resistance to the military-grade ammunition. When a round found its mark, the physical impact was jarring and absolute. The kinetic energy of the heavy bullets knocked people violently off their feet, throwing them backward into the sand or onto the hard pavement with sickening force. The pristine white of the traditional garments was instantly, violently ruined by sudden, dark explosions of crimson. The visual contrast was heart-wrenching and horrific, the pure, hopeful white of the maluniform blooming rapidly with the dark, heavy blood of fatal arterial wounds. The crowd, dense and tightly packed, became a tragic domino effect of falling bodies. As individuals were struck down, they collapsed into those around them, creating a tangled, desperate mass of the dead, the dying, and the terrified living. The bullets, possessing immense penetrative power, often passed completely through one victim only to strike the person standing directly behind them, multiplying the devastation with every single pull of the trigger. The sand, which only moments before had felt the gentle, rhythmic pressure of bare feet marching for freedom, now began to eagerly drink the blood of the fallen, turning rapidly from a pristine, sun-bleached white to a dark, saturated, and horrifying shade of red. In the midst of this overwhelming, mechanized slaughter, the deeply ingrained cultural instinct to protect one another manifested in acts of heartbreaking, ultimately futile heroism. Men and women, stripped of all hearing by the concussive roar of the gun, operated purely on a desperate, agonizing instinct. They threw their bodies over their children, over their elders, and over their fallen comrades, desperately trying to use their own flesh as a shield against the relentless rain of metal. They reached out with bare hands, instinctively trying to catch or deflect the invisible, supersonic projectiles that were tearing their community apart. It was a profound display of human love and solidarity, met with the cold, unfeeling reality of industrial weaponry. A mother's embrace could not stop a machine gun round. A brother's outstretched hand was instantly shattered by the impact. The colonial administration, operating from the safety of their elevated, fortified balcony, continued to pour a relentless stream of fire into these huddled, desperate masses. The scene was devoid of any combat or mutual exchange of hostility. It was an execution on a mass scale, an absolute slaughter of a civilian population that possessed no means of defending itself. The bodies accumulated on the coastal road, a tragic, literal mountain of evidence pointing to the extreme, unchecked brutality of colonial rule. The air became thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid stench of burning gunpowder, a toxic, sickening atmosphere that entirely replaced the fresh, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean. The Lewis gun continued its terrifying, mechanical chattering, a rhythmic, unyielding engine of death that systematically erased the lives, the hopes, and the futures of the people trapped below, ensuring that the peaceful morning would be forever stained by an atrocity of unimaginable proportions. Amidst the continuous, deafening roar of the Lewis machine gun and the horrifying reality of the indiscriminate slaughter unfolding on the coastal road, the narrative finds its most profound and tragic focal point. The sheer, mechanical intensity of the violence had created a landscape of absolute ruin, yet it was precisely within this crucible of carnage that the spirit of the Mao movement sought its ultimate, agonizing expression of peace. It was here, standing as a solitary figure against the relentless rain of metal, that the High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III made the choice that would etch his name into the bedrock of Samoan history. The scene was one of apocalyptic confusion. The road was a tapestry of broken bodies and saturated sand. The air was choked with the acrid, gray haze of spent gunpowder, and the cacophony of the automatic fire had rendered the world silent to those who still breathed. Yet, in that moment of total annihilation, there was a deliberate, singular movement that transcended the chaotic terror of the massacre. As the machine gun continued its rhythmic, heartless cycling from the balcony above, Tupua Tamasese Leolofi III stepped out from the desperate, huddled mass of his people. He did not crouch, he did not seek the minimal, illusory protection of the debris, and he certainly did not attempt to flee. Instead, he rose to his full, imposing height, a figure of extraordinary, calm authority amidst the storm of death, and began to walk forward. His action was a direct, visual rejection of the colonial narrative that had framed this entire day. By stepping into the open, by exposing himself entirely to the field of fire, the High Chief was making a final, silent, and immensely powerful appeal to the humanity of those who sat behind the trigger. He did not hold a weapon. His hands were entirely empty, hanging at his sides as he began to raise them in a slow, deliberate gesture of absolute, radical pacifism. It was a moment of crystalline clarity in the midst of a fractured reality. The High Chief, a man of immense stature and deeply respected lineage, stood as the living embodiment of the Mao movement's core philosophy. He was refusing, with his very life, to accept that the logic of the bullet was the only truth governing the island. As he reached the point of maximum exposure, he stopped, his feet planted firmly in the blood-stained sand of his homeland. He lifted his arms high above his head, the palms of his hands facing the balcony where the machine gun continued to pulse with lethal intent. This gesture, the universal sign of surrender and of peace, was not an act of submission to the colonial authorities, but an act of supreme moral defiance. He was offering himself, his own body, as a final sacrifice to halt the machinery of death, hoping that by standing as a clear, defenseless target, he might shock the gunners into the realization of the atrocity they were committing. The cinematic quality of this moment is almost unbearable to witness in the mind's eye. The sun, still shining with a cruel, mocking brilliance, illuminated the High Chief as he stood as a stark silhouette against the backdrop of the churning sea. His face, etched with a profound, sorrowful resolve, showed no trace of fear. He looked directly toward the balcony, his eyes fixed on the source of the mechanical death that was tearing his nation apart, his expression one of tragic, enduring hope that the humanity of the oppressors could still be stirred by an act of such utter, selfless devotion. For the people around him, the sight of their leader standing alone against the fire was a trauma of a different, more profound order. They watched, paralyzed by their own terror and their inability to intervene, as the man they revered, the man who had guided them toward this path of peaceful resistance, became the solitary focus of the colonial administration's final, murderous impulse. The High Chief did not speak, for words were entirely irrelevant in the face of the machine gun's roar. He stood as a testament to the idea that a leader is only as strong as the values they are willing to die for. His silence was louder than the gunfire, a deep, resonant, and permanent condemnation of the violence being unleashed upon his people. The tragic climax of his sacrifice arrived with the cold, mechanical inevitability of the weapon itself. The gunner on the balcony, indifferent to the profound moral message being enacted in the road below, continued the calculated, rhythmic sweep of the machine gun. As the arc of the fire passed over the beach, it found the High Chief standing, arms still raised, an open target in the blinding morning light. The reaction of his body to the sudden, violent impact of the heavy-caliber bullets was a final, terrible moment of physical truth. A short, sharp series of impacts struck his chest, each round carrying the force of a hammer blow, instantly devastating the heart and lungs that had sustained his life and his leadership. He did not crumble immediately. He seemed to pause, a brief, haunting second of defiance before the massive trauma forced his body to yield to the reality of the wounds. The light in his eyes, which had held a vision of a sovereign, peaceful Samoa, flickered and then dimmed, yet his posture remained, for an instant, upright and determined. He then began to collapse, a slow, majestic descent that felt as though it were taking an eternity. He did not fall like a victim. He fell like a monument that had been carved down, his life force draining away into the earth he had sought to liberate. As he reached the ground, his eyes remained open, Still fixed upon the source of the fire, the expression on his face a complex, agonized mixture of profound grief for his people and the steadfast, immovable commitment of a man who had remained true to his convictions until the very last heartbeat. The blood began to pool around him, dark and thick, a final, visceral baptism of the land. His death was the ultimate, shattering proof of the Mao movement's moral tragedy. The administration had killed their leader, the embodiment of their peaceful resistance, proving in the most permanent, undeniable way that they were willing to murder the best of the Samoan people to maintain their grip on the territory. The act had achieved the colonial objective of silencing the high chief, but it had also, in that very moment, rendered the administration's moral authority entirely and irrevocably void. The machine gun, having claimed the life of the most significant leader on the beach, suddenly fell silent. The sudden absence of the mechanical roar was more terrifying than the noise itself. It created a vacuum, a sudden, horrifying silence that was filled immediately by the visceral, raw sounds of the aftermath, the sobbing of the bereaved, the agonizing groans of the wounded, and the frantic, disorganized calls for help that drifted up from the sand. The silence that followed the death of the high chief was not a return to peace, but the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a graveyard. The gunner had finished. The machine gun was withdrawn from the balcony, a secret, mechanical atrocity being tucked away back into the dark, hidden interior of the colonial fortress. The silence of the weapon only served to emphasize the overwhelming, unbearable presence of the devastation. The beach, a sight of such beauty only hours before, was now a desolate, blood-drenched scene of human tragedy. The survivors, emerging from their paralysis, began to crawl toward the fallen high chief and the dozens of other victims scattered across the road. Their movements were jerky, traumatized, and slow, as they tried to reconcile the reality of the violence with the peaceful intention of their mourning. They gathered around the body of Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, their cries of anguish rising into the air, a mournful, collective wail that seemed to carry the weight of an entire nation's grief. They could not fix the broken bodies. They could not return the breath to the lungs of the fallen. They could only hold them, weeping over the shattered forms of their families and friends, their traditional garments now stained, torn, and heavy with the blood of their community. The visual impact of this scene is the final, searing image of the narrative. The high chief, lying in the sand with the clear, indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean behind him, represented the absolute, total rupture between the Samoan people and their colonizers. The sacrifice he had made, his deliberate, unarmed, and peaceful death, became the central, defining memory of Black Saturday. It was a death that transcended the specific political grievances of the moment and entered the realm of myth, a story to be told and retold by every generation of Samoans as the ultimate example of the price of freedom and the unshakable dignity of their people. The beach of Apia had been transformed from a public road into a sacred, haunted site. The sand, once white and pristine, would forever hold the memory of the blood that had soaked into it, a dark, indelible stain that served as a constant reminder of the day the colonial authorities tried, and failed, to kill the spirit of the Mao. As the survivors began the heart-wrenching, agonizing task of carrying the dead and the wounded away from the road, the atmosphere remained heavy with a lingering, profound sense of loss. The morning sun continued to climb higher, lighting the scene of the tragedy with a persistent, uncaring brilliance, as if to underscore the fact that history does not pause for human suffering. The life of the high chief had been violently ended. The machine gun fire had ceased, but the echoes of that final, peaceful gesture would resonate through the centuries, a quiet, immovable defiance that even the most powerful, industrialized violence could never truly silence. The sacrifice was complete, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow, anger, and an unbreakable, newfound resolve that would ultimately fuel the long, arduous journey toward the sovereignty they had so courageously and so tragically marched for on that fateful, blood-stained Saturday. The collapse of the Daewoo Samoa operation was not merely the end of a rogue business entity. It marked the beginning of an arduous, complex, and highly significant legal odyssey that would traverse the vast distance from the remote shores of American Samoa to the federal courtrooms of Honolulu, Hawaii. The sheer gravity, scale, and international implications of the crimes committed by Kil-Soo Lee and his subordinates necessitated a transition of the judicial proceedings away from the limited jurisdiction of the territorial court system and directly into the heart of the United States federal judiciary. This was a decision rooted in the necessity of applying the full, unyielding force of federal statutes, particularly those governing severe human rights violations, transnational human trafficking, and the egregious, systematic exploitation of human labor that the American legal system is meticulously designed to punish and prevent. The pretrial phase was characterized by a meticulous, exhausting, and highly systematic assembly of an overwhelming mountain of documentary evidence and testimonial accounts. Federal prosecutors, working in absolute, relentless collaboration with the investigators who had conducted the initial raid, compiled thousands of pages of incriminating records. These included the seized, meticulously hidden ledgers that documented the systematic withholding of wages, the deceptive contracts that had served as the foundation for the fraudulent recruitment process, and the harrowing, first-hand victim statements that cataloged every single instance of physical and psychological abuse, including the specific, horrific, and permanently disabling assault on Q.M. The prosecution's legal strategy was defined by a laser-focused, absolute dedication to the principle of accountability. They did not merely seek to prosecute the visible, immediate overseers of the factory. Their primary, absolute objective was to dismantle the entire, corrupt, and highly sophisticated architecture of exploitation that Kil-Soo Lee had painstakingly constructed. Throughout the unfolding of the legal proceedings, the courtroom in Honolulu became a theater where the horrific, hidden reality of the American Samoa sweatshop was finally, irrevocably laid bare to the objective, unsparing scrutiny of the American justice system. The testimony provided by the victims was, by all accounts, a profound, gut-wrenching, and entirely transformative experience for everyone present in the courtroom. Women who had been kept in a state of absolute, terrified, and profound silence for years, women who had endured the systematic destruction of their bodies, their identities, and their dignity, were finally, courageously standing before a federal judge, articulating, in agonizing, granular detail, the systematic torture they had been forced to suffer. As these women recounted the specific, deeply traumatizing experiences of their captivity, the chilling nature of Kil-Soo Lee's cold, unfeeling, and purely predatory business model became increasingly, undeniably, and entirely apparent. He was not a businessman who had lost his way. He was a calculated, deliberate, and entirely unrepentant architect of human misery who had viewed the vulnerable, the impoverished, and the young as nothing more than entirely disposable, highly profitable raw materials. The prosecution successfully, decisively, and systematically dismantled every single, fragile, and desperate attempt by the defense to minimize the horrific nature of the offenses or to distance Kil-Soo Lee from the direct, violent, and highly illegal actions committed by his subordinate managers. The evidence, ranging from the harrowing, eyewitness accounts of the brutal November 2000 violent suppression to the forensic, financial documentation of the systematically, maliciously stolen wages, formed an unbreakable and incontrovertible legal foundation of guilt. The defense's inability to present any meaningful, credible challenge to this mountain of irrefutable evidence underscored the absolute, catastrophic, and total nature of the criminal conspiracy that had been orchestrated under the direct and undisputed command of Kil-Soo Lee himself. By the year 2005, the legal proceedings finally arrived at their long-awaited, decisive, and entirely transformative conclusion. The federal court, fully considering the profound and devastating consequences of the defendant's actions, delivered a landmark and significant judgment that served as a loud, clear, and resounding signal that the American legal system would absolutely not tolerate such systemic and flagrant violations of fundamental human dignity. Kil-Soo Lee, the primary, malevolent architect of this entire horrifying human trafficking nightmare, was sentenced to a period of 40 years in a federal penitentiary. This sentence, reflecting the extreme severity and profound, lasting impact of his systematic, cruel, and heinous crimes, was a testament to the court's unwavering commitment to justice and accountability. The convictions encompassed a broad and expansive spectrum of criminal charges, including not merely the core offense of organized human trafficking, but also the egregious, systematic, and abhorrent practice of involuntary servitude, the malicious, orchestrated, planned, and concerted conspiracy to fundamentally, systematically, and permanently strip away the basic, essential legal and civil rights of the captive, exploited, and entirely vulnerable workforce, and the direct, explicit command and authorization of the extreme, physical, and brutal violence that had been repeatedly and systematically inflicted directly upon his many suffering and captive victims. The legal fallout extended well beyond the primary ringleader, with two of his primary, senior managing figures also receiving substantial federal prison sentences of between 4 and 5 years each, a clear and unequivocal judgment that underscored the entire organizational and shared guilt and liability of all those who had actively participated in the calculated, systematic, and abhorrent abuse. The courtroom became a place of finality, where the doors were closed on a chapter of human history that should never have been written, ensuring that the architects of such cruelty were removed from society and that the survivors could finally begin the slow, painstaking process of seeking some measure of restitution for the stolen years and the physical scars that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath of the massacre on the coastal road of Apia did not unfold with the clinical detachment of a judicial inquiry, but rather with the cold, defensive posture of a colonial administration desperately attempting to insulate itself from the consequences of its own brutality. Following the immediate silence that descended upon the beach, the reality of the tragedy was quickly swallowed by a systematic, institutional effort to control the narrative. The colonial government, having unleashed the most extreme form of violence upon an unarmed population, immediately pivoted to a posture of denial and justification. The initial response was not one of remorse or an urgent search for justice, but a calculated legalistic scramble to frame the events of Black Saturday as a justified response to an organized, violent insurrection. The investigation that followed, conducted under the direct oversight of the very entities responsible for the slaughter, was fundamentally compromised by a deep, institutional bias that viewed the Samoan victims not as citizens, but as subjects who had been rightfully subdued. The legal proceedings were held within the shadow of the fortress-like administrative buildings, where the victims of the gunfire were portrayed as the architects of their own destruction, their peaceful march twisted into a narrative of mob violence designed to overthrow the established colonial order. The process of the investigation was characterized by a profound, systemic erasure of the Samoan experience. Witnesses who had stood on that beach, who had seen their loved ones torn apart by the Lewis machine gun fire, were subjected to rigorous, hostile interrogations that sought to trap them in contradictions and delegitimize their testimonies. The proceedings were conducted in a language and within a legal framework that remained fundamentally alien to the indigenous population, serving as an intimidating, impenetrable barrier to any genuine pursuit of the truth. Every piece of evidence, the empty shell casings, the bullet holes in the nearby structures, the pools of dried blood on the sand, was processed through a lens that sought to protect the colonial officers from criminal accountability. The official reports produced by the administration minimized the disproportionate nature of the force used, failing to address the fundamental question of why an automated, military-grade weapon was deployed against a civilian gathering. Instead, the focus was placed squarely on the death of the single colonial police officer, a tragic event that was weaponized by the authorities to justify the subsequent, mass casualty retaliation. By fixating on this singular loss, the administration successfully diverted attention from the systemic, state-sanctioned execution of the 8 Samoan civilians, including the High Chief, transforming a massacre into a localized police action. The courtrooms were tense, suffocating environments where the power dynamic between the colonizer and the colonized was explicitly enacted. The judges and magistrates, appointed by the very colonial apparatus that had authorized the violence, presided over the proceedings with a stern, immovable commitment to maintaining the legitimacy of the administration. They treated the defense of the Samoans with suspicion, viewing the pursuit of accountability for the massacre as an act of political subversion. Throughout the hearings, the dignity of the Mau movement was continuously undermined. The lawyers for the administration utilized colonial statutes to systematically dismiss the grievances of the Samoan people, treating the peaceful demonstrations as illegal assemblies and characterizing the defensive, physical struggle of the crowd as a criminal riot. The tragic death of Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, which should have been the central focus of a profound investigation into the exercise of state power, was addressed only in passing, treated as an unfortunate, inevitable byproduct of a chaotic situation. The judiciary effectively acted as an extension of the colonial police, insulating the shooters from any real-world consequences and ensuring that the narrative of law and order remained intact, despite the undeniable, graphic evidence of mass slaughter. As the trials progressed, the psychological toll on the community of survivors became increasingly apparent. They were not merely grieving the loss of their kin, they were witnessing the final, cruel indignity of having their suffering denied and their truth rewritten by an oppressive bureaucracy. The legal outcome, as anticipated by the administration, was a complete exoneration of the colonial forces. No officer was held responsible for the indiscriminate firing into the crowd. No inquiry was launched into the command structure that authorized the use of the Lewis gun, and no reparations were made for the families of the dead and wounded. The judicial verdict was an absolute, cold confirmation that in the hierarchy of the colonial administration, the lives of the Samoan people held no weight compared to the security of the colonial mandate. The legal proceedings served only to confirm that the injustice of Black Saturday was not an aberration, but a functional element of the colonial rule itself, an exercise of power that relied on the threat of violence to maintain control, and the use of the law to legitimize the consequences of that violence. This lack of judicial accountability left an open, festering wound in the Samoan consciousness, a deep, structural resentment that would continue to fuel the movement for sovereignty for decades. The finality of the court's decision did not result in a return to the status quo, but rather forced the Mau movement to adapt to a new, more dangerous political reality. The massacre and the subsequent failure of the justice system stripped away any remaining illusions about the character of the colonial administration. The hope for a peaceful, negotiated transition to self-determination, which had been the driving force behind the march, was shattered. In its place, a hardened, more cynical resolve took root, a realization that the struggle for their rights would require a level of endurance and an unwavering commitment that transcended the simple, initial optimism of the peaceful protest. The survivors, having navigated the trauma of the beach and the humiliation of the courtroom, emerged from the entire experience as the living, walking testimonies of colonial injustice. They carried the memory of their dead, the specific image of their fallen high chief, and the cold, unfeeling verdict of the court as their primary, undeniable truths. The failure of the legal system to address the massacre did not silence the movement. It effectively nationalized their grief, transforming the tragedy of Black Saturday from a localized, peripheral event into the central, defining catalyst for the entire independence struggle. The courtroom results acted as a mirror, reflecting the true, limited scope of the colonial administration's concern for the people they ruled. Every statement made by a magistrate, every motion denied by a judge, and every exoneration granted to an officer served as an additional, concrete layer of justification for the Mau's rejection of the administration's legitimacy. The failure to seek justice was not seen as a defeat, but as a clarification of the battlefield. The colonial authorities, in their obsession with preserving their own narrative and protecting their officers, had inadvertently destroyed the last remnants of their moral claim to govern. The legal record of the time, filled with the sterile, clinical language of colonial law, stands today as a haunting, damning document of the era. It records only the justifications for the violence, omitting the human reality of the screaming crowds, the blood-stained sands, and the deliberate, final sacrifice of the High Chief. This erasure was the final, structural act of the massacre, an attempt to kill the history of the event as successfully as they had killed the people on the beach. However, The attempt to bury the truth under a veneer of legal legitimacy failed, as the story of Black Saturday continued to live on in the oral traditions, the cultural memory, and the burning, indomitable will of the Samoan people. The atmosphere in the immediate aftermath of the trials was one of a fragile, suppressed rage. The colonial administration, believing that the legal proceedings had effectively closed the chapter on the incident, moved to impose stricter controls, further entrenching their presence and increasing the frequency of patrols and surveillance. They operated with a misplaced confidence, feeling that the show of force on the beach and the seal of the court had sufficiently cowed the population into a terrified, silent submission. They could not perceive that their actions had not ended the resistance, but had instead, in the most profound way possible, ensured its survival. The legal outcome, which had been designed to provide closure and maintain authority, had instead functioned as a constant, grinding reminder of the administration's cruelty. It had transformed the peaceful aspiration for independence into an existential necessity. The survivors of the massacre, moving through their villages and communities with the weight of the tragedy upon them, acted as silent, permanent witnesses to the colonial hypocrisy. Their presence in the streets of Apia was a quiet, constant subversion of the authority that claimed to have achieved order. The failure of the courts to deliver justice meant that the question of responsibility remained, hovering over every colonial official and every administrative act, creating a permanent, unresolved tension that defined the relationship between the governing power and the people they had so brutally betrayed. The legal finality was nothing more than an administrative fiction, a paper wall erected to hide the reality of a moral collapse that would continue to haunt the colony until the final end of the administration itself. The echoes of the gunfire on that coastal road in Apia did not dissipate with the settling of the dust or the clearing of the blood-stained sand. They resonated through the decades, hardening into a foundational narrative of the Samoan national identity. The legacy of Black Saturday is not defined merely by the statistics of the dead or the cold, bureaucratic finality of the colonial courts, but by the profound, structural transformation of the independence struggle itself. The massacre served as a crucible, burning away the last, lingering naivety of the Mau movement and replacing it with a grim, existential clarity regarding the nature of the administration they were opposing. This transformation was not an overnight shift, but a deep, tectonic movement that altered the very bedrock of Samoan political life. The sacrifice of the 8 individuals who fell on that beach, and most significantly the deliberate, peaceful martyrdom of High Chief Tupua Tamases Lealofi III, became the central, sacred pillar upon which the future of the nation would be built. Their deaths effectively stripped the colonial mandate of its last shred of moral standing, revealing the reality of their rule not as a benevolent administrative project, but as a violent occupation maintained by the fear of industrialized death. In the years that followed, the story of the massacre became more than a historical memory. It became a living, breathing imperative for sovereignty. Every generation of Samoans born after the tragedy grew up with a knowledge of Black Saturday woven into their cultural consciousness, an inherited memory that served as a constant, burning reminder of the price of their freedom. The beach of Apia was transformed into a site of national pilgrimage, a space where the past and the present continuously intersected, forcing a confrontation with the reality of what it meant to resist a colonial power. The deliberate, nonviolent nature of the march, contrasted so horrifically with the machine gun's response, created an enduring, powerful moral contrast that the colonial authorities could never successfully suppress. By choosing to meet the peaceful assembly with a Lewis machine gun, the administration had committed a blunder of historic proportions. They had provided the Samoan people with an unassailable moral victory that no amount of subsequent administrative success or economic development could ever redeem. This moral victory fueled the persistence of the Mau movement even through the periods of intense repression that followed, giving the movement a resilience that was entirely independent of political fluctuations. The broader international impact of the event also began to ripple outward, gradually eroding the confidence of the New Zealand government and the legitimacy of their oversight. The image of a Pacific Island nation, known for its deep cultural grace and dignity, being systematically slaughtered by colonial troops, began to trouble the collective conscience of the global community. The news of the massacre, despite the administration's best efforts to censor and control the narrative, leaked out to the wider world, creating an increasingly unfavorable image of the New Zealand mandate. The pressure from external observers, combined with the unwavering, stubborn refusal of the Samoan people to abandon their cause, forced the colonial administration into a long, defensive, and increasingly untenable retreat. The events of Black Saturday became a recurring reference point in the global discourse on the rights of colonized peoples, a potent, visceral example of the inherent brutality of the imperial system. The colonial project in Samoa, once thought to be a model of effective administration, was increasingly viewed as a liability, a problematic and shameful stain on the international reputation of the governing power, which slowly but surely accelerated the push toward a path of decolonization. Reflecting upon the massacre from the vantage point of history, one is struck by the chilling, mechanical coldness of the colonial decision-making process. The deployment of the Lewis gun was not an act of spontaneous passion, but a considered, tactical choice made by individuals who had successfully dehumanized the population they were mandated to protect. This dehumanization is the most enduring, unsettling lesson of the tragedy. When human beings are reduced to targets, when their lives are valued only through the lens of political stability and bureaucratic order, the capacity for monstrous acts of violence becomes disturbingly easy. The colonial officers who stood on that balcony, who pressed the trigger and watched as their fire tore through the crowd, were not operating in a vacuum. They were the products of a system that actively cultivated an attitude of superiority and fear toward the indigenous population. The massacre, therefore, remains a permanent, necessary warning of what occurs when an occupying power loses its capacity to see the humanity of the people it governs, demonstrating that no amount of institutional power can truly justify or hide the consequences of such a moral collapse. The personal and collective grief that saturated the aftermath of the event was also a deeply transformative force, forcing the Samoan people to articulate their identity in a way that was entirely decoupled from colonial validation. The act of mourning the fallen became an act of national reaffirmation, a way to reclaim the lives that had been stolen and to assert that their memory was a sovereign, untouchable property of the nation. The specific, tragic detail of the High Chief raising his hands to plead for peace, only to be cut down in his moment of supreme courage, has become the archetype of the Samoan spirit, dignified, peaceful, and ultimately stronger than the mechanical force that sought to silence it. This narrative of the High Chief has provided an anchor for the national consciousness, a point of reference that has allowed the people to navigate their transition into an independent state with a clear, established sense of their own moral and cultural worth. The massacre is not a story of victimhood, but a story of endurance, a testament to the fact that while the colonial administration could steal their lives and stain their lands, they could not steal the spirit of the resistance or erase the moral truth of the struggle for independence. Looking back at the trajectory from that sun-drenched, blood-soaked Saturday to the eventual, hard-won sovereignty of the nation, one can see the ghost of that machine gun fire in every step of the journey. The massacre acted as a profound, irrevocable break in time, separating the colonial era from the dream of an independent Samoa. It created a debt of blood that had to be repaid by the achievement of a state where such violence would never again be possible. Every school built, every policy passed, and every international treaty signed by an independent Samoa is, in a profound, distant sense, a response to the silence that fell on the beach of Apia. The nation is a living monument to the lives that were extinguished on that day, a commitment to the ideal of self-determination that was purchased at a price so horrific that it continues to demand the most careful, respectful, and unwavering dedication to the principles of human rights and dignity. The tragedy is part of the national heritage, a heavy, sacred weight that ensures the memory of the struggle remains vibrant and urgent. As the years continue to move forward, the physical evidence of the massacre, the shell casings that were long ago swept away, the blood that soaked into the sand, has faded, but the truth of the event has only become more defined. It stands as a permanent, immovable marker in the history of the Pacific, a warning and a testament that continues to command our attention. The The story of Black Saturday reminds us that the struggle for justice is rarely a straight line, and that the history of human rights is often written in the ink of our own blood. The sacrifice of the people of the Mao, their commitment to the path of peace even as they were faced with the ultimate, mechanical violence of the colonial machine, remains a beacon of hope and a profound challenge to our collective moral imagination. It is a story that, while rooted in the specific, tragic history of Samoa, possesses a universal resonance, forcing us to ask difficult, necessary questions about the exercise of power, the necessity of peaceful resistance, and the enduring, unbreakable value of human life in the face of absolute, systemic oppression. The memory of that Saturday, stained black by the colonial administration's choices, but illuminated forever by the dignity of those who fell, continues to guide, to warn, and to inspire, standing as a final, unanswerable witness to the struggle for freedom. The final perspective on the tragedy of Black Saturday requires a deep, contemplative examination of the fundamental tension between the cold, rigid architecture of administrative power and the organic, pulsating vitality of a culture seeking its own destiny. As we look back upon the desolate beach of Apia from the vantage point of our current century, we must acknowledge that this event was not merely a localized clash between police and protesters, but a profound, universal collision between an outdated imperial ideology and the rising, undeniable tide of human self-determination. The colonial administration of the time operated under the delusion that they were agents of civilization, bringing order to a territory they viewed as inherently fractured and subordinate. They failed to realize that their presence was, in itself, the primary source of disorder, a foreign imposition that stifled the natural governance and cultural equilibrium of the Samoan people. The machine gun on the balcony was the logical, ultimate conclusion of this delusion, a weapon chosen because it promised to erase the problem of indigenous descent through the simple, mechanical application of overwhelming force. The tragedy lies in the fact that the administration was never able to perceive the humanity they were destroying. They looked down upon the marchers and saw only a dangerous, faceless obstruction to their operational efficiency. This dehumanization is the most enduring, unsettling lesson that we carry forward from the events of 1929. When we examine the records of the time, the cold, clinical minutes of administrative meetings, the detached language of the reports justifying the use of lethal force, and the sanitized legal arguments presented in the subsequent hearings, we are confronted by the terrifying ease with which institutions can justify the destruction of human life. The people who authorized the firing on the crowd were not necessarily born as monsters. They were men who functioned within a system that had effectively decoupled them from the emotional and moral consequences of their actions. They were trained to see the world in terms of strategic mandates, logistical challenges, and the preservation of political status. The massacre was the logical output of a mindset that prioritized the abstract survival of the colonial mission over the concrete, breathing lives of the people who inhabited that mission's territory. By stripping the Samoan people of their status as individuals, the administration created the conditions under which a machine gun could be used against a civilian population without provoking a total moral catastrophe within the ranks of the colonial government itself. In contrast, the memory of the victims of Black Saturday serves as an enduring, sacred witness to the importance of maintaining our capacity for empathy even in the face of immense, systemic pressure. The individuals who marched on that beach were asserting, in the most profound way possible, that their lives and their dignity were not negotiable commodities to be traded for administrative convenience. They walked into the storm of fire with their humanity entirely intact, their faces turned toward the balcony not with malice, but with a plea that was fundamentally human. The High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, in his final, decisive act, challenged the mechanical coldness of his oppressors with the only power that truly matters, the power of an unyielding moral witness. His sacrifice was not a victory in the conventional, strategic sense, it was a victory of the spirit. He demonstrated that even when the state employs the full, industrial capacity of its violence, it cannot force the victim to adopt the moral logic of the executioner. He died as a free man, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the cage they had built around his country, thereby ensuring that the moral weight of the conflict would forever rest upon the shoulders of a colonial administration. As we consider the long-term historical impact, we must also address the necessity of remembering this tragedy with a level of rigor and respect that refuses to gloss over the darker, more difficult truths. It is tempting to frame history through the lens of eventual success, to use the fact of later independence as a way to soften the blow of the initial, horrific costs. But the reality of Black Saturday remains sharp, jagged, and unmitigated. The 8 lives lost were not merely stepping stones on the path to sovereignty. They were, in themselves, a complete, irreplaceable universe of human potential, family connection, and cultural heritage. Each of them had their own hopes, their own responsibilities, and their own place within the vibrant fabric of their community. To honor them properly, we must hold onto the visceral, uncomfortable feeling of the loss, ensuring that our narrative of the past does not become a tool for minimizing the trauma of the present. The history of the Pacific is often told through the stories of the explorers, the administrators, and the external powers, but the true history of the region is etched into the very soil of the islands, written by the people who lived, struggled, and died to maintain their connection to their heritage. The narrative of Black Saturday also provides a critical, ongoing critique of the ways in which contemporary powers interact with indigenous populations and vulnerable groups. The dynamics of 1929, the reliance on overwhelming technological superiority, the tactical erasure of the dissenting voice, the bureaucratic denial of state responsibility, are patterns that continue to manifest in various forms today. Whenever a dominant power views a population as an impediment to be managed rather than a community to be engaged, the conditions for a Black Saturday-style tragedy are essentially in place. The massacre serves as a historical red flag, an urgent warning that the integrity of our political systems is directly measured by how they treat those who lack the power to defend themselves. If we are to build a future that is truly just and peaceful, we must cultivate the courage to look at the machines of state power and ask, in every instance, whether they are being used to protect the rights of individuals or merely to enforce the preferences of the administration. The High Chief's raised hands are a perpetual, silent question directed at every governing body in the world, asking them to justify the violence they hold in reserve and to account for the humanity they are tempted to discard. In the final, profound sense, the legacy of this event is one of an unbreakable, enduring spirit that defines the Samoan people. The narrative of the Mau movement is not a story of a nation that was defeated by a machine gun, but a story of a nation that was forged in the fire of an impossible choice. They chose to be free, even when the cost of that choice was their own blood, and that decision has resonated through every generation since, creating a national identity that is inherently resistant to outside domination and deeply, fundamentally committed to the preservation of their unique, ancestral way of life. The beach of Apia is now, in the collective imagination of the country, a site of immense, transformative power, where the darkness of the past is continually being transmuted into the light of the future. The memory of the event serves as a moral compass, ensuring that the nation never loses sight of the foundations of its own independence, and providing a constant, necessary check on the exercise of its own domestic power. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten because it is a story that, in its own terrible, beautiful way, speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human in a world that is often dominated by forces that are entirely indifferent to our struggle. As the waves continue to wash against the shore of Apia, carrying the salt and the history of the Pacific, they seem to murmur the names of the 8 who fell on that day, and the name of the High Chief whose life was the final act of the morning's tragedy. They were the architects of a future they would not live to see, the seeds that were planted in the blood-stained sand to grow into the tree of modern, independent Samoa. The colonial administration, with all its machinery, its legalistic defenses, and its illusion of permanence, has long since retreated, its influence eroded by the very forces of history it attempted to halt. But the Mau movement remains, present in the pride of the people, in the strength of their culture, and in the unwavering commitment they maintain to the sovereignty of their island home. The story of Black Saturday, therefore, is not a closing chapter, but a perpetual, open testament, a lesson that humanity, when it is grounded in truth, dignity, and the pursuit of justice, will always outlast the cold, sterile mechanics of the state. It is a story of a Saturday that began in the light of an ordinary morning and ended in the dark of an extraordinary crime, a day that forever changed the world by proving that even when you are faced with the most absolute form of destruction, the choice to remain peaceful, to remain dignified, and to remain oneself is the most powerful act of defiance that any human being can ever possess. The memory of these people and the legacy of their struggle will continue to serve as a beacon of light, guiding all those who believe that the power of the human spirit will, in the end, always be more enduring than the power of the gun. The final consideration of the Black Saturday tragedy must move beyond the immediate historical analysis and into the realm of the eternal, examining how such a profound rupture in the human experience settles into the collective soul of a nation. It is a mistake to view the massacre as a finite event contained within the year 1929. Instead, it is a living, breathing shadow that has accompanied the Samoan people through their journey toward maturity, statehood, and global presence. This shadow is not one of mere darkness, but one of profound, transformative wisdom. It is the wisdom earned by those who have looked directly into the abyss of industrialized, colonial violence and found that their own humanity remained, miraculously, intact. The resilience displayed by the Mao movement, a resilience that refused to adopt the methods of its oppressors even as it was being systematically dismantled by them, is a standard of conduct that echoes through the modern era. It challenges us to reconsider the definition of victory. If victory is the ability to maintain one's moral integrity while facing annihilation, then the men and women on that beach were not merely victims of a massacre. They were the victors of a moral confrontation that the colonial administration had no idea it was even participating in. This perspective elevates the story from a tragedy of oppression to a testament of human agency. The colonial authorities, in their frantic and unimaginative deployment of the Lewis gun, revealed the fundamental, existential limitation of their power. They possessed the means to destroy bodies, to extinguish the breath of the living, and to stain the earth with blood, but they possessed absolutely no mechanism for destroying the idea that had brought the crowd to the beach in the first place. That idea, the inherent right of the Samoan people to govern themselves in accordance with their own traditions and values, was entirely immune to the caliber of their ammunition. This realization, once it settled over the community, became the foundation of all subsequent resistance. It allowed the movement to survive the death of its leadership and the failure of its initial demonstrations, providing a quiet, unshakable confidence that the colonizers' clock was already winding down. The massacre, by exposing the moral bankruptcy of the New Zealand Mandate so transparently, accelerated the psychological liberation of the population, making the eventual achievement of sovereignty feel not like a gift from the administration, but like an inevitable outcome of the Samoans' own internal evolution. As we examine the physical setting of this narrative, the Apia coastline, we find a site that has been transmuted by memory. It is no longer just a place of geography. It is a place of pilgrimage, a sanctuary where the past and the present continuously converse. When the modern traveler stands on that stretch of road, they're standing in a space defined by the convergence of the ocean's infinite, rhythmic promise and the finite, catastrophic reach of human history. The contrast remains striking and essential. The beauty of the Pacific, which shone so brightly on that fateful morning, serves as a natural, unyielding witness to the folly of the violence that was enacted upon its shore. The sea, with its endless, churning cycle of tides, washes away the physical stains of the past, yet the collective memory of the people ensures that the truth of the event remains as constant as the current itself. This creates a powerful, recurring dialogue between the environment and the history of the nation, one that reinforces the idea that the land itself is a primary, active participant in the story of the Mao movement. Furthermore, we must address the enduring, haunting figure of the High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, whose actions have achieved a level of cultural resonance that transcends the boundaries of standard political biography. He has become a mythic figure, a repository of the national identity, whose life and death are continuously reinterpreted and reaffirmed by each new generation of Samoans. His story is not just one of resistance against an occupying force. It is a profound, philosophical inquiry into the meaning of leadership and the nature of courage. To die while attempting to stop the violence of others, to offer one's own body as the barrier between the gun and the innocent, is an act of such ultimate, radical love that it remains nearly impossible to process through the conventional language of political struggle. It is a narrative that forces us to pause and reflect on our own capacity for self-sacrifice, challenging us to consider whether we possess the inner strength to hold to our principles when the entire world is screaming for us to run, to strike back, or to hide. His legacy is the most potent, enduring weapon that the Samoan people possess, a moral armor that is entirely indestructible. The broader implications of this tragedy also remind us of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted in our modern, post-colonial world. It is easy to look back at the early 20th century and see it as a distant, darker era, but the impulses that led to the events of Black Saturday, the institutional arrogance, the systemic dehumanization, the violent suppression of dissenting voices, are not relics of the past. They are persistent, dangerous tendencies within the human condition. The story of 1929 acts as a beacon, shining a light on the specific, repeatable conditions that lead to such atrocities. It forces us to maintain a constant, vigilant awareness of the ways in which state power is communicated and enforced, and it demands that we prioritize the protection of human dignity above the administrative efficiency of any system, no matter how powerful or entrenched it may appear to be. The sacrifice of the Mau movement is a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal, active participation, and that the quiet, day-to-day work of maintaining our humanity is the most difficult and necessary labor that we can perform. In the final, cumulative sense, the narrative of Black Saturday is a testament to the fact that nothing of genuine, historical significance is ever truly forgotten. The colonial administration may have tried to bury the truth under a mountain of legalistic paperwork, and the passage of time may have muted the screams of the dying, but the narrative has emerged, stronger and more resonant than ever, as a foundational block of the Samoan national story. It has become a narrative that belongs to everyone, a shared, public property that serves to bind the community together in a common, historical bond. It is a story that teaches us that even in the face of the most absolute, industrialized destruction, the human spirit is capable of generating a response that is more enduring, more powerful, and ultimately more truthful than any weapon that could ever be manufactured. The legacy of the people who marched, the people who suffered, and the people who died on that day is a legacy that will continue to move across the Pacific, touching the hearts and minds of all who seek to understand the true, hidden costs of our collective human journey. As the narrative concludes, we are left with the image of the sun, the sea, and the sand, the same physical elements that witness the tragedy and now witness the enduring, triumphant reality of an independent, sovereign Samoa. The tragedy was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long, arduous, and ultimately victorious climb toward the realization of the Samoan dream. The memory of Black Saturday continues to provide the moral energy for that nation, a quiet, insistent, and undeniable force that ensures their sovereignty is not just a political reality, but a profound, lived, and deeply felt experience of dignity and self-worth. The story of the 8 who fell and the High Chief who led them remains as a beacon, a final, unanswerable response to the darkness of the colonial era, and a beautiful, enduring reminder that the light of the human spirit will always, eventually, break through the clouds. It is a legacy that belongs not just to Samoa, but to the entire world, a testament to the fact that when we stand for justice, when we act with peace, and when we hold our dignity as the highest possible prize, we become a force that not even the most absolute, mechanical violence can ever truly defeat. The march may have been interrupted, the voices may have been silenced, and the blood may have been shed, but the spirit of the Mau movement continues to walk along the coast of Apia, forever, in the golden, eternal light of an island that has finally and rightfully found its own way home. As we arrive at the culmination of this exploration into the heart of the Black Saturday tragedy, It becomes necessary to synthesize the scattered fragments of history into a cohesive, enduring understanding of what was truly lost and what was, in a miraculous sense, gained. The massacre on the shores of Apia on that December morning in 1929 was not merely an event that occurred. It was an event that altered the very fabric of how a nation defines its soul. By examining the trajectory from the serene, sun-drenched dawn to the blood-drenched sand, and finally to the long, arduous process of collective memory and statehood, we have witnessed the systematic brutalization of an unarmed people and their subsequent, triumphant reclamation of their own identity. The colonial mechanism, in all its cold, industrialized precision, operated on the assumption that it could impose order through terror. Yet, this mechanism failed to recognize that a culture rooted in deep, ancestral connection to the land and a profound, shared spiritual rhythm is fundamentally immune to the destructive power of a machine gun. The ultimate failure of the New Zealand administration was not a failure of logistics or military execution, but a failure of imagination. They simply could not conceive of a form of resistance that prioritized dignity over safety and moral righteousness over physical survival. The sacrifice of High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III stands as the anchor of this narrative, a point of absolute moral gravity that pulls all the chaotic, disparate elements of the tragedy into a singular, undeniable truth. His final act, that deliberate, calm, and utterly selfless elevation of his hands, serves as a permanent indictment of the colonial system. It effectively stripped away the veil of bureaucratic justification, revealing the colonial mandate for what it truly was, a fragile, insecure enterprise that required the extreme, indiscriminate slaughter of civilians to maintain its appearance of authority. When he was struck down, his death did not signal the end of the Mau movement. Instead, it acted as a catalyst, sanctifying the cause and providing the resistance with a martyr whose life and death were entirely congruent with the movement's stated ideals of peace and self-determination. His legacy has since become the bedrock of the Samoan national identity, a constant, quiet reminder that true leadership is measured by the capacity to embody the highest values of one's people, especially when those values are under the most intense, life-threatening pressure. This is a lesson that transcends the specific history of the Pacific, offering universal template for any community that finds itself standing before the crushing weight of systemic, institutionalized oppression. When we consider the nature of memory in the aftermath of such a trauma, we see that it functions not as a passive record of the past, but as a dynamic, evolving architecture of the present. The Samoan people have not allowed the massacre to become a static, museum-bound relic of a bygone era. Instead, they have integrated the tragedy into the vibrant, ongoing life of their nation. It is a memory that is spoken in the local language, taught in the schools, and reflected in the values that guide the governance of the state. This is the ultimate form of defiance against the colonial ambition to erase the indigenous perspective. By keeping the story alive, by holding the truth of Black Saturday as a non-negotiable component of their national consciousness, the people of Samoa have effectively reclaimed the narrative from their former rulers. The administration that once tried to hide the truth behind legal obfuscation and judicial exoneration has been relegated to the archives of history, while the truth of the victims, the voices, the songs, and the final, peaceful gestures remains as fresh and immediate as it was on that December morning. This is the victory of the human story over the bureaucratic file, a triumph that demonstrates the enduring, creative power of a nation that refuses to be defined by the violence committed against it. The aesthetic and emotional weight of this narrative also compels us to address the role of empathy in our historical engagement. To study Black Saturday is not an act of intellectual curiosity, it is an act of empathetic witness. We are asked to imagine ourselves on that beach, to feel the heat of the morning, the tension of the crowd, and the terrifying, sudden eruption of the Lewis gun. We are forced to grapple with the fragility of our own peaceful lives and the unsettling reality that the machinery of destruction is often hidden behind a veneer of legality and order. This empathetic engagement serves as a necessary, sobering check on our contemporary understanding of power. It forces us to ask whether the structures we inhabit today are truly serving the cause of human dignity, or whether they are simply refinements of the same colonial impulses that led to the slaughter in Apia. The history of Black Saturday thus functions as a mirror, reflecting our own values back to us, and asking if we would have the moral courage to stand as the High Chief did, or whether we would succumb to the paralyzing, seductive logic of compliance. Furthermore, we must recognize the role of landscape as a witness to the truth. The geography of Apia, the specific, curved line of the coastline, the depth of the ocean, the shifting sands, has served as a silent, persistent keeper of the event. While the structures of the colonial administration have been repurposed or have crumbled away, the geography remains, hosting the memory of the dead and the pride of the living. This environmental connection to the history is a central pillar of the Samoan cultural worldview, a philosophy that posits the land, the sea, and the ancestors as a unified, coherent whole. In this light, the massacre was an assault not just on the people, but on the land itself. The blood spilled into the sand was a violation of the sacred contract between the people and their home. The subsequent reclamation of that land, the transition to a sovereign state that governs the environment in accordance with indigenous values, is a healing process that is inextricably linked to the resolution of the trauma. The land is no longer a site of colonial control. It is the stage for a thriving, sovereign life, a testament to the fact that the people have remained, while the foreign power has passed away. As we look toward the future, the lessons of Black Saturday continue to provide a necessary, steady guidance for the Samoan people and, indeed, for all peoples who strive to maintain their sovereignty in a complicated, increasingly connected world. The tragedy teaches us that the path to true independence is paved not with the wreckage of our enemies, but with the integrity of our own choices. It teaches us that peaceful resistance, while often dismissed as weak by those who hold the levers of industrialized power, is actually the most potent, enduring force for change in human affairs. It teaches us that the memory of our ancestors is not a burden, but a resource, a deep, inexhaustible well of wisdom, courage, and moral clarity that can be drawn upon to meet the challenges of the modern age. Samoa stands today as a beacon of this reality, a nation that has processed the darkest chapter of its history and emerged from the other side with a deepened, refined commitment to the values of community, respect, and peaceful coexistence. In the final, cumulative sense, the story of the Black Saturday Massacre is a profound exploration of the limits of power and the infinite capacity of the human spirit. It is a story that refuses to be simplified, a story that demands our full attention, our deepest empathy, and our most rigorous reflection. It is a story that, while rooted in the specific, tragic history of a Pacific Island nation, speaks with a universal, resonant clarity to the human condition. It tells us that while the state may possess the capacity for unimaginable violence, it does not possess the capacity to extinguish the fundamental, inherent dignity of the individual. It tells us that while history may be written by the victors in the short term, it is the truth of the victims that ultimately shapes the long-term consciousness of a nation. And it tells us that as long as we continue to tell these stories, as long as we continue to look into the dark corners of our past with a clear, honest gaze, we remain capable of building a world where the voice of peace is never again silenced by the machine. As the narrative closes, we are left with the enduring image of the light, the golden light of the Pacific morning, the light of human dignity, and the light of a truth that will never be extinguished. The tragedy is part of the tapestry of who we are, a thread that is woven with the dark, heavy wool of loss but brightened by the shimmering, resilient silk of human hope. It is a story that requires no further embellishment, no rhetorical flourish, and no moral justification. It simply stands, as the beach stands, as a final, unanswerable witness. The story of Black Saturday remains as a permanent, necessary part of our collective heritage, a story that reminds us of the terrible price of freedom and the extraordinary, beautiful power of those who are willing to pay it. It is a story that continues to resonate, to teach, and to inspire, reminding us that no matter how dark the morning, no matter how loud the violence, and no matter how heavy the cost, The dream of freedom is a light that will always find a way to burn through the darkness, illuminating the way for all those who are still walking the long, slow, and ultimately triumphant journey toward home. The final reflection on the Black Saturday tragedy necessitates a transition from the historical accounting of events to a broader philosophical meditation on the nature of collective memory and the enduring power of truth in a world that often seeks to obscure it. As this extensive narrative reaches its conclusion, it is essential to acknowledge that the story of Apia is not merely a chronicle of 8 lives extinguished and a movement suppressed. It is a profound testament to the necessity of bearing witness. The act of documenting, analyzing, and remembering this event is, in itself, a form of resistance against the oblivion that colonial powers sought to impose. Every word written, every voice raised in remembrance, and every reflection on the High Chief's sacrifice serves to dismantle the architecture of the lie that was once used to justify the massacre. This final act of reflection is a commitment to the idea that history, when confronted with honesty and empathy, possesses a curative property. It allows us to process the trauma of the past not by burying it, but by transmuting it into a source of national and personal strength, ensuring that the legacy of those who fell is not one of victimization, but one of eternal, unyielding significance. When we consider the transition from the immediate trauma of 1929 to the contemporary reality of an independent Samoa, we are observing a triumph of the human spirit over the rigid, mechanical constraints of imperial control. The colonial system was built on the premise that power could be measured in terms of firepower, administrative reach, and the ability to command obedience through fear. However, the survival and eventual success of the Mau movement proved that power is ultimately derived from the collective will and the moral authority of a people who know who they are and what they are fighting for. The administration's reliance on the Lewis machine gun was the clearest possible signal that their moral argument had entirely collapsed. It was an admission that they had run out of ways to lead and had defaulted to the only remaining tool of a failed system: the raw, indiscriminate application of force. In the long arc of history, this transition from persuasion to violence is the undeniable marker of an ending. Samoa, in its journey to statehood, has carried this lesson forward, ensuring that its governance is built not upon the capacity to intimidate, but upon the foundation of mutual respect and the recognition of the fundamental dignity of every citizen. This evolution is fundamentally linked to the role of leadership, as exemplified by the High Chief Tupua Tamases, Leolofi III. In the vacuum left by the collapse of colonial legitimacy, his final gesture emerged as a new, more profound form of power. He demonstrated that leadership is not about the command of armies or the authority of the state, but about the willingness to stand for one's principles in the face of absolute, overwhelming peril. His death transformed the political struggle into a moral one, setting a standard for all future leaders of the nation. It taught a generation that the true measure of a leader is found in their ability to endure suffering without compromising their humanity. This ideal has become woven into the very fabric of the Samoan political culture, serving as a silent, invisible check on the excesses of power. It is a reminder to all those who hold office, whether in the past, the present, or the future, that the history they inherit is one that was purchased at an unimaginable cost, and that their primary responsibility is to honor that cost by governing with integrity, compassion, and a tireless commitment to the welfare of the people they serve. Furthermore, we must address the enduring, transformative impact of the massacre on the Samoan cultural consciousness, specifically regarding the relationship between the people and their land. The beach of Apia, as we have observed, is more than a geographic location. It is a living document. The soil there holds the resonance of the songs that were cut short and the blood that was shed in the name of freedom. The reclamation of this land, from a space of colonial imposition to a center of national pride, has been a central theme in the country's post-independence history. This reflects a deeper, indigenous understanding of the world, one that recognizes that a people cannot be truly free until they have reconciled with their history and reclaimed their connection to the environment. The tragedy of Black Saturday, by forcing a confrontation with the most painful aspect of their collective history, pushed the Samoan people toward a more authentic and profound sense of self. They were forced to grapple with the reality of their trauma, and in doing so, they developed a capacity for resilience that is both ancient and entirely modern, rooted in the past but focused on the potential of a future that belongs entirely to them. As we look at the global landscape today, the story of Apia takes on an added layer of urgency and relevance. In an era marked by the resurgence of nationalist tensions, the questioning of democratic institutions, and the persistent, often violent suppression of dissenting voices, the lessons of 1929 are not just academic, they are vital. The world remains full of systems that, like the colonial administration of the 1920s, believe they can solve the challenge of human difference and political struggle through the imposition of force. The history of Black Saturday serves as a permanent, immovable warning to all such systems. It shows that force can win the battle of the day, but it will always lose the battle of the century. The voices that are suppressed will eventually find a way to be heard, and the people who are treated as objects will eventually demand to be recognized as subjects. The massacre reminds us that the quest for dignity is an unstoppable, universal current, and that any system that attempts to dam this current will eventually be overwhelmed by its force. The act of writing this narrative, of bringing these events into the clarity of contemporary understanding, is itself an extension of the resistance that began on that December morning. It is a refusal to let the silence of the colonial era become the permanent state of the historical record. By engaging with the tragedy, by naming the victims, by analyzing the motives of the oppressors, and by honoring the courage of the High Chief, we participate in a process of moral restoration. We validate the experience of those who suffered, and we ensure that their sacrifice is not filed away in the dusty corridors of an archive, but is kept alive as a dynamic, influential force in our common history. This is the ultimate purpose of all historical inquiry, to transform the raw, agonizing data of the past into the refined, guiding wisdom of the present. The tragedy of Apia, by being brought into the light, has been stripped of its ability to remain a source of darkness and has instead become a source of illumination. In the final, profound sense, the story of the Black Saturday Massacre is a testament to the fact that the human spirit is a force of nature. It possesses its own tides, its own seasons, and its own indomitable capacity to overcome the most catastrophic, man-made interruptions. The colonial administration, with its arrogance and its hardware, was ultimately nothing more than a passing, discordant note in the long, resonant song of the Samoan nation. The song, which began long before 1929 and continues to be sung today, is one of persistence, of deep cultural pride, and of an unshakable faith in the value of human community. The massacre was a moment where the song was momentarily fractured by a discordant, violent noise, but the melody survived. It survived because it was carried in the hearts of the survivors, passed down through the generations, and reinforced by the memory of the 8 who died. The song now rings louder than ever, a triumphant, polyphonic celebration of a people who have successfully navigated the darkness and have emerged, whole and sovereign, into the light of their own, self-determined day. As the narrative finally concludes, we are left with the silence, not the fearful, traumatized silence of the massacre, but the peaceful, reflective silence of a nation that is at rest with its history. The beach of Apia lies quiet once more, the ocean waves continuing their rhythmic, eternal cycle, oblivious to the political struggles of men but perfectly attuned to the deeper, natural time of the island. The memory of the event rests in this silence, a quiet, abiding presence that informs the identity of all who walk there. The High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, whose life was ended in the pursuit of peace, finds his ultimate, lasting victory not in the defeat of his enemies, but in the enduring, flourishing sovereignty of the land he loved. His legacy is the air, the water, the songs, and the freedom of modern Samoa. It is a legacy that belongs to all humanity, a story that continues to teach us that no matter how much force is applied to the individual, the dignity of the human person remains the most resilient and ultimately the most powerful truth we possess. The journey of the Mau movement is complete, and the memory of their struggle, having transcended the tragedy of its birth, now serves as an eternal, unwavering guide for all those who believe that the light of truth and the spirit of peace will, in the end, always find a way to prevail against the darkness. The conclusion of this chronicle concerning the tragedy of Black Saturday inevitably draws us toward the horizon of the future, where the memory of 1929 continues to function as a profound and vital compass for the Samoan nation. As we step back from the granular analysis of the massacre and the subsequent judicial failures, we are struck by the realization that this event has been permanently incorporated into the national DNA, transforming from a singular trauma into a perennial source of moral strength. The story is no longer confined to the textbooks or the oral traditions of the elders. It has become an ambient, omnipresent truth that shapes the political and social landscape of the modern state. The transition from the mourning of the dead to the celebration of sovereignty has been a long and complex process, yet it is through this process that the nation has achieved a rare and valuable form of maturity, a statehood that is not defined by its distance from the colonial past, but by its deep, unflinching engagement with it. This is a form of maturity that is entirely earned, built upon the foundation of a truth that was once silenced by gunfire but now speaks with the authority of a national consensus. Looking toward the horizon, the legacy of the Mao movement serves as an essential framework for addressing the ongoing challenges of statehood in an increasingly globalized world. The commitment to self-determination that drove the marchers to the Apia beachfront remains just as relevant today as it was in the late 1920s, albeit in a vastly different political context. The contemporary Samoan state, as it engages with the broader international community, continues to draw upon the moral clarity that was forged in the fire of 1929. The refusal to compromise on the principles of dignity, sovereignty, and communal welfare is a direct, linear extension of the philosophy that the Mao movement fought to establish. This commitment ensures that the nation's participation in global affairs is not merely a matter of tactical interest, but a reflection of a core, foundational set of values that were paid for in blood and, therefore, are held with an intensity that cannot be easily swayed or corrupted by the fluctuations of external power. The memory of the massacre acts as a protective layer, ensuring that the nation's trajectory remains aligned with the aspirations and the honor of its ancestors. The pedagogical significance of this history cannot be overstated, as it provides the foundation for the character of the next generation. For the youth of Samoa, the story of Black Saturday is not a distant, abstract event. It is an intimate, formative narrative that informs their understanding of what it means to be a citizen in a sovereign nation. By learning the specifics of the massacre, the names of the victims, the courage of the high chief, the betrayal of the colonial institutions, the next generation is being equipped with a framework for critical thought and ethical responsibility. They are taught to recognize the precursors to institutional violence, to value the importance of nonviolent resistance, and to appreciate the profound weight of the freedom they have inherited. This transmission of history is the ultimate form of triumph over the colonial ambition to erase the indigenous perspective. It ensures that the memory of the struggle remains vibrant, functional, and deeply embedded in the identity of every individual, creating a society that is uniquely attuned to the importance of human rights and the inherent, absolute value of the person. Furthermore, we must reflect on the role of the global community in honoring and learning from this specific history. The tragedy of Black Saturday should not be viewed as an isolated, localized event of interest only to those within the Pacific region, but as a critical, representative case study for the entire world. It offers a clear, undistorted view of the mechanics of colonial oppression and the indomitable power of peaceful resistance, providing a narrative that serves as a mirror to our own collective struggles for justice. The international community, by engaging with and acknowledging the truth of this event, participates in a broader, global process of moral reckoning. It is an opportunity to validate the experiences of colonized peoples, to challenge the narratives that continue to mask the violence of the past, and to commit ourselves to a future where such acts of state-sanctioned slaughter are never again tolerated. The story of Apia is a vital contribution to the global archive of human history, a testament to the fact that the quest for truth is a shared, universal, and fundamentally transformative enterprise. As we look toward the potential of the future, we find that the resilience of the Samoan spirit is an optimistic and compelling indicator of what is possible when a community refuses to yield its core principles. The world is often dominated by narratives of defeat, cynicism, and the inevitability of power, but the history of the Mau movement offers a direct, powerful counter-narrative. It reminds us that there is no power, however industrialized or absolute it may appear, that is capable of conquering a population that is united by a common truth and a shared dedication to the principles of dignity and self-determination. This is the great, enduring lesson of 1929. The machine gun was an instrument of immediate, temporary control, but the spirit of the movement was an instrument of lasting, historical change. The former destroyed lives, but the latter built a nation. This distinction is the most important takeaway for anyone who wishes to understand the dynamics of historical transformation, as it highlights the absolute, irreversible superiority of the human spirit over the material apparatus of the state. The environment of the Apia coast, which continues to exist in its rhythmic, natural cycle, serves as the final, silent witness to the conclusion of our narrative. The water, the sand, and the sky remain indifferent to the political machinations of the colonial past, yet they provide a sense of timelessness that puts the events of 1929 into a much broader, natural perspective. The human struggle for justice, while agonizingly intense and deeply personal, is part of a larger, long-term evolution of the human community, one that is slowly but surely moving toward a state of greater awareness, respect, and mutual recognition. The memory of the tragedy, as it rests in the landscape, serves as a reminder that we are all part of a continuous, ongoing chain of history, and that our actions in the present are the foundation for the reality that will be inhabited by those who follow. We carry the memory of the High Chief and his people not as a burden, but as a lantern, a guide that informs our path through the complexities of our current time, ensuring that we never lose sight of the moral foundations upon which our common, human future must be built. As we bring this long, detailed, and deeply impactful narrative to its conclusion, we are left with the sense of a profound, completed cycle. The tragedy that began in the dark of the morning and ended in the slaughter of the innocent has been fully integrated into the consciousness of a nation, processed through the furnace of memory, and emerged as the basis for a life of sovereignty, dignity, and purpose. The High Chief Tupua Tamases Leolofi III, who gave everything to preserve the hope of his people, has achieved a form of immortality that is far more durable than the influence of the colonial governors who once commanded the machine guns. He lives on in the consciousness of his people, in the structures of their state, and in the quiet, insistent pride of every Samoan who walks the earth today. His legacy is the realization of a dream that was once seen as an impossible fantasy by the colonial power, but is now the lived, tangible, and vibrant reality of a people who have finally and rightfully reclaimed their place in the sun. The final image we carry with us is that of the sea, the Pacific, infinite and unyielding, reflecting the light of an afternoon that is finally, after the long, dark shadow of 1929, arrived at a place of clarity. The history of Black Saturday is now a closed book in the sense that its primary, traumatic events have been fully addressed and integrated, but it remains an open book in the sense that its moral lessons are timeless, continuing to instruct, to warn, and to elevate the human experience. It is a story of total loss followed by total reclamation, a story that demands our respect, our attention, and our unwavering commitment to the truth. As we leave the beach of Apia in our mind's eye, we recognize that the struggle was not in vain, that the sacrifice was recognized, and that the future which was fought for is now being lived. It is a victory that is silent, persistent, and entirely complete, a testament to the fact that when a nation holds onto its own history with a firm, honest, and loving hand, it becomes a force that can withstand the most terrible of storms and emerge, eventually, into the calm, enduring, and beautiful light of its own, self-determined truth. The cycle is closed, the peace is established, and the memory remains as a bright, guiding star for all, ensuring that the light of those who walked that road for freedom will continue to shine, unbroken and eternal, for as long as there is a world that values the sacred, inherent, and non-negotiable dignity of the human person.